Alright, and we are live. So, I'm going to be responding to this Cosmic Skeptic video that has Joe Smid, Trent Horn, and Cameron Bertuzzi from Corruption Christianity. My previous video was also a response on the problem of evil. I unlisted it now because in hindsight I don't think it was very good. So hopefully this one will be better. But in any case, I know Nathan Ormond at Digital Gnosis already did a review of this video. I have not watched his review though, and chances are I'll be bringing in a lot of the same points that he already brought in. So this isn't going to be exactly original. But I was bored and I thought this might be a bit of way as any to waste my time. I mean, there's really not much else for me to do these days, anyways. So without further ado, I guess we might as well just get into it.
I think there are certain goods you can't have them without a concomitant evil, like compassion or courage.
An example I've sometimes given is the example of someone like Martin Luther King being a great man, right? Because he overcomes this great evil. Surely we'd rather be living in a world where there were no racism and no need for Martin Luther King. It sounds to me that in a lot of cases, when somebody says...
I just disagree. I mean...
You think it's better to actualize a world in which there is racism?
I think it's more valuable. I think a world that has that...
So yeah, I knew Cameron had this view, but I think that this is a completely insane, crazy view. Like I think most people who are morally sensible or sensible to moral considerations or sensitive to moral considerations, so to say, are probably going to reject this view. Like the idea that all the suffering entailed by having racism in the world is worth it, just so we can have like the occasional like virtue building, the occasional like heroism, the occasional theater for a good speech, seems completely unintuitive and seems to like a lack of originality in terms of the goods that the goods and evils in this world that could be there. Because it seems to me that having this kind of heroism in response to suffering is only good insofar as there is suffering in the world to respond to. In a world where there is no suffering, there would still be goods, right? But heroism wouldn't be a necessary good in terms of like there being like suffering that's necessary to respond to. I think Stephen Meitzen makes a similar kind of point, right? The idea that a world with these virtues is all things considered better seems to just be like a lack of creativity on the part of the theist in terms of like actualizing good states of affairs, in terms of like actualizing worlds. It just doesn't seem intuitive at all, and it just seems I don't know, it just seems like a crazy view to me. But like we haven't even gotten started to the video yet.
That and has the accompanying evils is more valuable. I've seen videos of like animals being like ripped apart like on Reddit and stuff. Sometimes you'll look at the animal and they look peaceful, like they're being ripped apart and they're just like sitting there like this, just like getting their leg like ripped off.
The theist may say, well, maybe God just isn't all powerful. That may be the case, but such a ghost of a God is hardly different from atheism or worth believing in.
This episode of the Cosmic Skeptic podcast is brought to you by you. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Cosmic Skeptic.
A Catholic, a Protestant, an atheist, and an agnostic all walk into a house in the Bible Belt. This sounds like the beginning of a joke, but it is in fact the beginning of today's episode of the Cosmic Skeptic podcast, because in a rather ambitious attempt to expand the podcast and make it reach...
I guess I'll start off by like saying that I don't really have like an opinion on most of the people participating in this episode. Like Trent Horn I haven't seen a lot from, but he strikes me as sort of okay. Like he's pretty inoffensive in my opinion. Like nothing special, but also nothing that I'm particularly like have seen that has gotten on my nerves or anything. Like I really just don't have an opinion on him. Same with Cosmic Skeptic. Similar. Like I used to think his videos, Cosmic Skeptic's videos, were generally kind of poor. But I think he's improved a lot lately. A lot of his later videos are pretty decent, actually. Joe Schmid, I actively think is probably like the best guest here. Like his videos are amazing, and like a little bit advanced for people who are not like into the philosophy of religion yet. Like he's a little bit advanced, but his videos are really great and really informative. And he's a pretty smart dude. He's had some pretty good discussions on his channel. And Cameron Bertuzzi, I don't really have much of an opinion on either. Like I know a lot of people don't like him, but I really like haven't seen much of him, and everything I've seen from him is again pretty banal and inoffensive. And obviously he said some stuff that I disagree with, and obviously he said some stuff which I take to be nonsense, and I don't think his videos on the problem of evil are particularly good or anything. But aside from that, like I really don't have an opinion on any of these guys aside from Joe Schmidt, who I watch regularly.
New heights. I've invited 3 other guests onto the podcast with me today. I'm joined by Cameron Bertuzzi, our resident Protestant. I'm joined by Joe Schmidt, our agnostic, Trent Horn, our Catholic, and I am, as always, Alex O'Connor, your atheist. And we decided it would be fun, since we're all here together in Houston, in order to do an event, the Capturing Christianity Exchange, which at this point will be in the past, so the videos of the interactions that we're all going to be having in our public event, I'll put the links down in the description. We thought while we're here it'd be cool to sit down as a 4 and talk about something which is important to all of us from our different perspectives. It comes up regardless of how you're talking about the subject of religion, which is the problem of evil. And what better company to talk about the problem of evil with than people who come at it from completely different approaches. So, I don't really know how we should best begin this, but I guess for myself...
So I'm expecting Trent to come in with a sort of privation of good theodicy, and I'm expecting Cameron to come in with something like soul building, like a kind of a combination approach where he brings in the soul building and the anomic regularities theodicy and free will. That's what I'm generally expecting here, but I guess we'll have to wait and see.
The problem of evil is easily the greatest argument against the existence of a God. Would we all agree that that is the case?
You mean for people in general, or for us?
In your view, I mean, like what, in terms of arguments that would seek to establish kind of strong atheism that God doesn't exist.
I would say historically the problem of evil or unjustifiable suffering is a strong one. I mean, Aquinas basically dealing with the arguments for God really dealt with 2 arguments against God. One's the problem of evil, and one is the problem of essentially scientific explanation apart from God. So I would say historically, yes. Though I mean, it's not. I have other concerns more so than the problem of evil. For me personally, it was never as big a hurdle to get over as maybe for other people.
What do you guys? Do you think it's a?
I think it's the biggest challenge to perfect being theism is the way that I would put it. So Joe and I were talking about this in our interview. Is that like what is the real breadth of the problem of evil? Like of all the different types of theisms that might be out there, which one does it really target? And I think that it targets primarily perfect being theism, where you've got these tri-omnis, the omnibenevolent God, the omnipotent God, and does it really like so? There's a philosopher who I interviewed recently on my channel. His name is Philip Goff. Is he a philosopher? I think he's a philosopher. Yeah, and he's got this concept of God that he's sort of toying around with at the moment, where he says that God is all good, but he's not all powerful. And what he argues is that the problem of evil doesn't really even like say anything about that type of God, if that God exists.
Yeah, that's a view. There was a rap.
That's a bit of a strange view, but I guess like I don't see why like rejecting that God is all powerful would make the problem of evil go away. Like as long as God is sufficiently powerful that he can intervene in creation and do more than what he's like doing right now. Like say someone's getting raped and God can intervene in such a way to like perform a miracle to prevent the rapist or something or a million other things like that, like preventing cancer, preventing disease. I mean, like God doesn't have to be all powerful to have sufficient ability to prevent the kind of evils we see in the world, right? He just has the ability, and presumably he does have that ability if you want to say that he's the creator of the universe and he created all these physical laws in the first place. Presumably he has a way, like he's powerful enough at least to like modify them, or he could have created a different universe with different physical laws that like link different states, like such as painful states. They aren't linked to specific parts in the brain when in response to certain stimulus. Like he could have created a different set of physical laws. Like if he was powerful enough to create this universe, I don't see why he wouldn't be powerful enough to create a different universe with different natural causal laws and whatnot. And presumably there's like multiple instances of God intervening and performing miracles in the Bible. And if he can do that, then it certainly seems he can do at least a lot more than what he's doing right now to intervene and prevent evil. So I don't see how that follows.
Rabbi who, I forget his name right off the top of my head, but his 14-year-old son, I think, died of a degenerative disease. And that was essentially the conclusion. That view's been around for a while. The conclusion he came to, how do I understand this horrible death of my son and being a rabbi?
Yeah.
He said, well, God loves us and he wants to help us, but he just can't.
Yeah.
I love, there's a book, an old book by this guy, B.C. Johnson, called The Atheist Debater's Handbook. It's like this little book I found in the library once. And it was funny, he was dealing with the problem of evil. He said, the theist may say, well, maybe God just isn't all powerful. And he said in the book, that may be the case, but such a ghost of a God is hardly different from atheism or worth believing in. So I thought that was an interesting reply from him. That, like, I think for a lot of atheists, I don't know, it's like perfect being theism or bust.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Because of
Yeah.
the idea that maybe God is all loving but not all powerful.
I mean, I don't know if I agree with that. Like, if you have like a being who is not quite all powerful, but extremely powerful, extremely knowledgeable, and extremely good, like good to a greater extent, at least than all humans are, then I think that there's at least some reason to think that that's a God that's worthy of worship. Perhaps like at least some reason, yeah.
It seems to me a difference without distinction to most theodicies, that is, in their practical effect. If you have a theodicy, which for anyone listening who doesn't know is an attempt to, reconcile the existence of a loving God with the existence of evil in the world, or at least suffering in the world.
Well, not just a loving God. An omnipotent. Well, unless you're trying to make
A
distinction
God, a God, and any
that is both
attempt.
all loving and all
Well,
powerful.
it does depend. Traditionally speaking, to reconcile God and evil would be a defense to give a reason to explain why God allows evil, and the goods he's achieving would be theodicy.
That's right.
Yeah, so the basic difference from what I've heard is that a defense would be something like in response to like a logical problem of evil, where basically the idea would be that there's this further proposition you can add to theism that makes it the case that you have like a jointly consistent set with evil in the world and theism being true. Like it's logically compatible. Like the evil we see in the world is logically compatible with theism. But of course, then you have the evidential problem of evil, which can grant, like, yeah, sure, evil is logically compatible with the existence of God, but the existence of evils we see in the world, or you can even say like the moral randomness and the specific like distribution of pain and pleasure we see in the world provides like very strong evidence against theism. It makes theism like highly unlikely. It's highly likely that theism is true given the facts of evil we see in the world. And that's when a theodicy would come in, which basically tries to explain that, which tries to like add a hypothesis to theism, which makes it the case that evil isn't extraordinarily improbable under theism. And that's where you get things like soul building. And there's also like a distinction between the free will theodicy and the free will defense. Free will defense is from Plantinga, which tries to argue that against Mackey's problem of evil, and tries to argue that it's logically possible that God could permit evil for the sake of greater good, such as free will. Free will theodicy doesn't argue that it's just logically possible. It argues that that is one of the reasons, at least. It's the reason, or one of the reasons, why God permits evil in this world. And they might want to say that perhaps it doesn't absorb all evils, such as natural evils, but it absorbs a lot of moral evils. Like a lot of the moral evils we see in the world is plausibly explained by God's allowing free creatures to have free will. So that's the basic difference between a theodicy and a defense. The defense just argues that evil is logically compatible with the existence of God. A theodicy argues that given theism, the evil we see in the world is not so insanely improbable, or it's not basically it offers a plausible explanation given theism for the existence of evil we see in the world.
Right, that's a helpful distinction. I think in terms of trying to justify, let's say, the existence of a God in the face of evil and suffering, people have given lots of famous examples. They talk about the fact that God wants us to have free will. He talks about the fact that God allows evil and suffering to bring about higher order goods. But to me, this translates to saying something like, well, God has this end which he desires to bring about, and potentially needs to bring about if he's a maximally great being. If he's by nature good, he might need to bring about the best outcomes, or at least have a duty to bring about particular outcomes.
I'm skeptical of that, but you can keep going. But I frown my nose.
Yeah, a lot of people frown that too, and I'm not sure I can even agree with it myself, just because I'm not sure what it would mean to bring about like the maximal amount of good.
Or the idea that God has to do that.
Yes.
For example, imagine God made a world, a universe like ours, but it only possessed inorganic matter. And it actually had a lot of beauty. Like it had waterfalls and rocky crags and meteors and volcanoes and all kinds of cool stuff. Would it be bad for God to make that kind of world? It would have no suffering in it whatsoever. So I doubt you would think that God was bad for making the world this inorganic matter. But I think a lot of us would think you can make that better with people and conscious beings. But I don't know if God is like obliged to make it better. So I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Well, there's like a couple points to make here. The first is that you're like in terms of problem of evil, like the stronger versions are going to probably be framed in terms of what would be wrong for God to permit. Like, is there states of affairs in this world that it would be wrong for an omnipotent being to permit, all things considered? And obviously, this is where you get the standard examples such as horrific suffering, roast fawn and diseases and whatnot. So yeah, like this would be like a difference. Like there's a difference between like because there's nothing actively wrong with creating a new world with beauty and inorganic matter if there's no suffering. Like, whereas it would be like actively, like there would be like wrong-making properties exemplified in a world where there's no like there's all this gratuitous suffering that don't have like justifying greater goods. Like they're just suffering, unjustified suffering. So that's like one, like that's the biggest way to frame the problem of evil, to make it more convincing and more plausible. And another point to make is even if God is not obliged to create this this world, well, to not create the world of inorganic matter, because it's like just because it's not the best possible world doesn't mean that God's obliged to not create it. Well, there's still a further question of whether God, given his attributes, would create such a world, because it seems to me that God, being a perfect being, or the best, or the greatest conceivable being, like the best kind of being that it could be, if you imagine a being that creates a less than perfect world, or a world that's less good than another world, so world Y is good, whereas world X is a lot contains like much higher goods and much greater goods, then it seems to me that it's entailed from like God's attributes that God would create like world X rather than world Y, because it just follows, like, because like, presumably at least one way to sort of measure the kind of greatness of beings is by understanding the worlds they create, like by looking at the worlds they create. So for example, a being that creates a world that's greater than another being creates is going to be, all things considered, like if all their other properties are held equal, the being that creates a greater world is going to be greater than the being that creates a lesser world. And this is just taking all things into account, like all their properties, all their other attributes are held equal, but being one creates a greater world and being two creates a lesser world. Well then, it's just going to follow that the being that creates the lesser world is not the greatest being conceivable, because there's a being that's a possible being that's greater, that creates a greater world, right? And this is going to apply to God as well, right? Because God is supposed to be the greatest conceivable being. Like all his attributes are exemplified in the maximal extent. Like he exemplifies all great making properties to the absolute maximal degree, and no being could be greater than him. Like it's not possible for any being to be greater than him. So if you imagine a being that has all the attributes that God has, but creates a greater world rather than a lesser world, well then it's just going to follow that God's not the greatest conceivable being, because you can imagine a being that created a greater world that has all of God's attributes but created a greater world. So in that sense, like while it may not be the case that God is obligated to create a greater world, there's still an argument to be made here. There's still going to be a problem in the sense that God couldn't be the greatest conceivable being if he doesn't create a greater world rather than a lesser world. So yeah, there's still going to be like an issue there.
Whether he needs to or not,
but it's something to expect from him, not to drop the ball.
The justifications are kind of are given that take a form of saying that God has some other purpose which he seeks to fulfill, such as free will, and the idea is that there's some kind of metaphysical or logical impossibility.
And surely, I hope that this wouldn't be controversial, right? Like, presumably, like all things considered, a being that creates greater worlds rather than like lesser worlds is going to be, like all things considered, like greater than a being that creates lesser worlds, right? Like if you hold all their other properties equal, surely it isn't controversial that the being that creates a greater world is better than the being that creates the lesser world.
With God bringing about, say, a world of free creatures and there being no suffering or something like this. And so in a sense, something like a free will defense that says, well, there's just no way to bring about free will without suffering. It's like a way of saying, well, God is all loving, but because he's got this thing, free will, that he wants to bring about, he's just incapable of preventing this kind of suffering, because if he were, we wouldn't have free will. So a kind of response that makes sense of a God that allows suffering, that says, well, maybe God's just not all powerful, it seems to me the same kind of thought as many other kinds of theodicies, because they're essentially saying, well, kind of God, it's not like God's happy about this suffering taking place, but he just doesn't have the power to take it away, either because there's some kind of thing that he needs to bring about that requires suffering, or just because there's something he wants to bring about that still makes it impossible for him to not have suffering. It seems like a similar kind of approach.
I guess it depends on what you mean by all-powerful. I mean,
That's the key.
Yeah, I mean, if it's metaphysically impossible, like if there's no way that reality could be such that God could bring about these goods without allowing certain sorts of evils to transpire, then it's no mark against God's omnipotence to be bound in this way. After all, it's impossible for God to have done otherwise. He couldn't have had the power to do that because it's an impossible power, essentially. So I don't really see that as compromising God's omnipotence. It just depends on how you cash it out.
Yeah, well, neither do I, but I mean, in terms of how people might make sense of this, when somebody says something like, well, I've gone through a horrible experience, and so the only way I can make sense of this is to think that maybe God just isn't all powerful. They could be equally captivated by a view that says, you're so nearly right. You're right that the suffering exists because God somehow has to allow it, but it's not because he's not omnipotent. It's just because either there are things that an omnipotent being can't do,
I think
that means he's not an omnipotent
Joe's
God.
kind of
Right?
on the path. It's like God is saying, well, God has allowed this suffering, and it could be the case that there is a particular good that would not be accessible without it. So I mean, if you think about like omnipotence is like power is the ability to do something. There are just some things
God's power
no
is
amount of
limited
power
to
can do
him.
because they're impossible for whatever reasons. I think what you're getting on the free will issue, there's kind of two different ways to go about it. Well, although I don't want to derail from the point that you were making. I'll put it out there and you can tell me if I'm derailing. One approach is kind of like planting his view. It could be the case God can't make a world where all free creatures choose good because we have these counterfactuals of freedom. Like you make Cameron, you put Cameron in a world, whatever.
Don't use me in this example.
By the way, Cameron will always choose the wrong in some possible world. I'm not sure I'm really inclined
Yeah, this is where we get to trans world depravity and all that stuff.
to that. I think God can make a world where only free creatures choose things, but it would also lack certain goods. And so it may be the case God has reasons
Only free creatures choose things. I'm guessing he means free creatures always choose the good. I'm guessing that's what he means.
for allowing certain good. Like I would agree. I think there are certain goods you can't have them without a concomitant evil, like compassion or courage.
Oh, then we'd be getting into a soul building theodicy, not really a free will theodicy.
Yeah.
You might have things that look like them but aren't them.
Of course, we spoke before. I mean, we had a debate on Matt Fradd's channel a while ago, and we spoke a little bit about this. I can't remember if we spoke specifically about this topic, but the idea of there being these goods like bravery that can't come about unless they're parasitic on some suffering or evil.
Right.
To me, something like bravery is only good insofar as it overcomes some form of suffering or evil. Like
I would agree with that. Yeah.
it seems to me if you could have a world without the suffering and without the bravery, without the fear and without the bravery, this would be more desirable because sure, you wouldn't have bravery, but if you don't need bravery, it doesn't just seem to me to be like a good thing intrinsically. It seems only good relative to the existence of some form of fear and suffering. Without the fear and suffering,
Yeah, I brought this point up earlier.
it wouldn't be intrinsically good. In fact, if you removed the fear and suffering and somebody was still acting in the way that a brave person would act, you'd say they were just being like
Or like, yeah, basically they would have they would have a disposition for bravery, but it wouldn't be the case that they would ever need to like act out in their bravery because they just have like this latent sort of disposition for bravery, right? If there was like some evil to respond to, then they would respond with bravery. That's what like a disposition is. However, given that there's no evil in the world, they never have to act brave. So that this would be the idea that you know there would be this disposition for bravery, and the theist has to be committed to saying that like it's not merely the disposition for having bravery that's good making that makes the world better, but like just actually having the having to act brave, like having circumstances where bravery, like your disposition to act brave, is actually actualized. Like is actually you need some situation to respond to in order to act brave. Basically, sorry, I'm not really explaining myself right. I should probably start over. Basically, they want to say that like merely having the disposition is not good enough. You actually have to act brave. Like there has to be actual like bravery exemplified in the world. With your actions and with your responses to certain situations, such as soldiers acting courageous in the face of a war. And that's what they have to be committed to. They have to be committed to saying that bravery actually being exemplified as a greater good. And um, well, one problem with this is like I just don't think it's intuitive. Like I don't see why we should think that having to act out bravery is all things considered better than merely having a disposition. Like I don't understand why we should think that. I don't have that intuition at all. Um, and another problem is it doesn't seem to me that the kind of suffering we see in the world is necessary for bravery to be exemplified, right? Like I've used this example before, but like imagine sports, right? Like imagine athleticism. You can imagine, athletes exemplifying their bravery by playing football, baseball. They fear losing. They fear, letting down their teammates. They fear letting down their families. So that fear drives them to act brave when engaging in the sports. But obviously, the kind of bravery that's tied to athleticism doesn't entail a great deal of suffering, such as like the kind of suffering you would see in wars, right? So, just seems to me that you don't need to have like the kind of suffering we see in the world, the kind of great suffering we see in the world to have bravery actually be exemplified in terms of like athleticism, sports. There's probably some other examples that are lost on me right now, but that would be like a primary example. And now, the theist might be tempted to respond that, well, maybe there is bravery in response to athleticism, but surely the kind of bravery that athletes possess is not as great as the bravery of soldiers. So there wouldn't actually be as much good in the world in terms of like qua bravery if you just have athletic bravery and no like bravery of like military men or army men or whatnot. And well, one thing is I don't see why that has to be the case. Like I don't see like they need to provide like evidence of that in order to convince me. Like sure like there's a sense in which you might say that it's like more brave to for like army men to participate in wars, but it doesn't seem to me that there's this more bravery exemplified in the world, all things considered. Necessarily, at least, if you have soldiers exemplify bravery, and even if it is the case that soldiers are necessarily more brave than athletes, always like they always like necessarily like in this world it's always the case that soldiers are more brave than athletes. Even if you do grant that, like it doesn't seem to me that it's logically necessary that soldiers are more brave than athletes, like in terms of their actions. Like you can imagine God actualizing a world where the kind of bravery exemplified by athletes is just as good as the bravery exemplified by soldiers. Like it doesn't seem to me logically incoherent that God could have done that. So there's multiple lines here of objection that could be made. Again, the first is that having a disposition versus like bravery actually being exemplified in the world, it's not exactly intuitive to me that bravery actually being exemplified in the world is all things considered better, especially if it entails all this suffering we see. It doesn't seem to me intuitive at all or plausible at all that bravery being exemplified is better than merely having a disposition for bravery. And even if it is better, it doesn't seem to me that intuitive that it's worth all the cost of all this suffering, so to speak. So that would be the first point. The second point is, it doesn't seem to me that exemplifying bravery actually requires a great deal of suffering in the first place. Again, I gave the example of sports and athleticism. You can imagine the Olympics, football, baseball, hockey. And I gave some examples of how bravery can be built by engaging in these activities. And the theist might be tempted to say that, well, even if that is a kind of way that bravery can be built, it's not as good as the ways that bravery can be built in response to suffering, in response to actually like risking your life. And I can grant that while that may be true in this world, most of the time, I don't see why that has to be like logically necessarily the case. You can imagine God actualizing a world where the same extent of bravery is exemplified in athletes as as it is in military men in this world. Like, it doesn't seem to me that there's a logically necessary connection between the kind of bravery that soldiers exemplify and actually acting on response to suffering. Like, it seems to me perfectly plausible that athletes can have that same bravery. And this is just like a few objections to the kind of soul building considerations. I actually have like a bunch of more objections, but like we'll get to those later.
Modest, you think it was a bad thing?
Well,
See, here, let me jump in real quick. I don't know that we can actually advance the conversation when you make that kind of move. Because to me, I think the problem of evil, I don't want to say that it collapses into axiology, but that's very central to the problem of evil, is this notion of like, what is most valuable? Because God is going to instantiate the world that is most valuable. And what you're saying is that a world that doesn't have these goods, but also
Yeah, okay, so Cameron actually already brought up like something that would kind of relate to one of my other objections, which is that we're talking about axiology right now. And if we're talking about like sure, we can talk like all of my objections I made so far have to do with axiology, but and sure, we can grant, like we can even like say that all of my objections so far fail and grant that in terms of axiology, the world with like soldiers going into war and the bravery that instantiates is, all things considered, axiologically superior to the world where where we don't have this suffering, and people just have a mere disposition towards bravery, or bravery is only instantiated in athletes. Like, the world where soldiers exemplify bravery is, all things considered, like axiologically superior. And let's say all my objections to that end fail, like all my axiological objections fail. We still have deontic concerns, whether it be right for God to use creatures in such a way, like as mere means to an end, like using them and their suffering, and like permitting them to suffer as a way to achieve his end of permitting bravery in the world. It's still a further question, a further deontic consideration, whether God would be acting rightly in doing so. And my intuition is that even if God would be permitting, like promoting better, like sort of axiological goods, we'd just be talking about consequentialism if you say that God's permitting better, higher axiological goods means that God would be justified in doing so, because like that's just consequentialism. Like, God would be just bringing out greater goods and causing agents to suffer in the process. Like that like basically that this is just like sort of like something like consequentialism, right? Like it would be like good to like do whatever you want with agents, use agents as mere means to an end, basically do whatever you want with agents if it's for the sake of promoting a greater good, or promoting like a greater axiological world. So basically this would be like assuming a sort of consequentialism, and I think that this is a problem with a lot of talk of the problem of evil. It assumes a sort of consequentialism. However, when we bring in deontic considerations, even if the world with with bravery instantiated by or like, we've only been talking about bravery so far, but there's a million other examples like compassion, kindness, generosity being exemplified in response to suffering. Even if we grant that world is, all things considered, axiologically superior, it's still a further question whether God would be justified in permitting such a world, because it could still be wrong for God to use agents in such a way to permit them to suffer horrifically for the sake of these greater ends. It could still be wrong for God to do so, right? And then intuitively, I think it would be wrong, right? I think it is wrong to, sit by and watch a baby fucking burn to death, even if it does like promote, greater virtues in the mother, like in the state of affairs would be, all things considered, better, right? Like even if the mother gets like built virtues as a result of the baby burning to death, it seems to me that an agent would be doing something wrong by allowing this to happen. They would be using the baby as like a mere means to an end to achieve greater goods. So yeah, even if we grant all the axiological stuff that I said earlier fails, like all the objections, and I grant the theist's very controversial suggestion that the world, specifically the world where humans don't have a mere disposition towards bravery, and there's all this suffering in the world, and humans are brave in response to the suffering, and humans are kind and compassionate and generous in response to the suffering, even if I grant that in terms of axiology, that world is all things considered better than all the other worlds that possibilities such as the world with no suffering, disposition towards bravery, disposition towards compassion, all those other worlds. Even if I grant the very controversial and very, I would add, probably implausible suggestion that that world is the greatest of all those worlds, we still have this further deontic consideration, and I would probably justify it with my deontological theory that God would be impermissible to permit such a world, even if it is all things considered greater, it's a greater good. Because I think that using agents as mere pawns as a goal to achieve, or as a means to achieve greater goods, it seems to me that there's something that's immoral about that. There's something that's wrong making there. So yeah, that's another consideration.
Doesn't have the suffering.
We're only 12 minutes in, and I already brought in a lot of responses to a lot of the theodicies, preempting a lot of what they were probably going to be talking about a lot later. So I should probably shut my own mouth a bit more.
Is more valuable than a world that does have those goods with the evils that sort of come along with it. So, and like, how do you advance when you kind of put your foot on the, what's the right term? Put your foot down, and you're like, I just don't think that that's as valuable. Like, I think what's most valuable is a world that doesn't have that. And then what can we say? We can say, well, we think that a world that has those higher order goods and the accompanying evils, like, we think that's more valuable. And it's like, how do you actually progress there? That's kind of, I think we may actually run into like a stalemate.
Because I think that there are different intuitions on different goods that are supposedly served by suffering. For example,
well, I think generally the idea that a world with every single bit of suffering we see, but has these higher virtues, these bravery, this compassion, I think that being the best out of all the possible selections God could have made, such as the selection of God creating a world without suffering, God creating a world without agents at all, God creating a world where He exists alone, God creating a world where agents have dispositions. I don't know if I said this one already, but agents have dispositions towards all these virtues, and there's no suffering to respond to. I think I said that one already, but you can even imagine a world where agents don't have dispositions, but there's no suffering. So it's basically kind of like a sort of morally indifferent, sort of neutral world. Then you have a world where suffering, where bravery, compassion, and whatnot are built through engaging in athleticism, having sympathy for characters in fictional arts. You can imagine that world where there's a different degree, where there's different sorts of states of affairs with less suffering involved, where agents can still build certain virtues up. There's that world, and there's probably a bunch of other worlds I can name. I've already named the world where God exists alone. I already named an empty world, and a world with pure aesthetic beauty and no agents. There's a billion worlds that God could have actualized, rather than the world specifically where all this suffering exists, and agents have bravery, and agents souls are occasionally built through bravery and compassion. And it seems to me that sometimes there are cases of moral randomness, though, where there's no potentiality for soul building as well. So there's also this consideration about the exact sort of distribution of suffering we see in the world, the exact sort of considerations about people suffering who never get a chance to build their souls and whatnot. There's a billion other worlds God could have actualized rather than this world, and the idea that this world specifically is the one that is the axiologically the best, it seems to me that very, very unlikely and very, very implausible, I might add.
the example of bravery, I think, is maybe a bit of a poor one, because it seems intuitively to me that we'd rather have no need for bravery and no bravery, in the same way that.
See, but that's just you. I don't think that. I think that courage is, or bravery and courage is very valuable.
Compare it, for example, though, to something like the free will defense, which I think is a bit easier to argue that something like free will is just of a different category of
you could
thing.
you could pick something else. You could pick compassion, for example,
or forgiveness.
Let's say somebody is, let's say someone experiences compassion for the suffering of a fictional character, and even that I don't think is
okay. So he's actually bringing sort of preempting my objection here. So let's see what his response is.
Like, I agree with you. Like, courage where there's no real danger is very like Don Quixote, very like okay. But like, you know, but to watch a film and to feel an emotional compassion towards the sufferings of a person that doesn't exist, you know, they're fictional. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the existence of the compassion itself, it is a good thing.
Yeah, it may be, and maybe that for that reason it's.
So he's actually not like I was expecting him to like sort of like get into like the weeds here and sort of like respond to the kind of objection that I was putting forth. But he's, if anything, this seems to be more of like a concession, because I don't know what Trent Horn's exact response to the problem of evil is. I think it's going to end up being something like a privation of good theodicy, based on what I've seen in his debate with Ben Watkins. But yeah, I'm actually surprised. I was expecting to actually have to defend my position here.
So it's a better example. I think that to answer your point, Cameron, I think that this isn't kind of equally obviously true with all of these higher order goods. I just think that with something like bravery, it seems to be fairly intuitive. I mean, you said you prefer to live in a world where there is fear and suffering so that we can have the good of bravery. An example I've sometimes given is the example of someone like Martin Luther King being a great man, right? Because he overcomes this great evil. Surely we'd rather be living in a world where there were no racism and no need for Martin Luther King. It sounds to me that in a lot of cases, when somebody says...
I just disagree. I mean...
You think it's better to actualize a world in which
I think it's more
racism?
valuable. I think a world that has that and has the accompanying evils is more valuable.
Yeah, I think that's... I've already discussed this, but I think that's a crazy view.
I mean, and that's why I say that I think we may be at a stalemate. Like when you make that move, we're just disagreeing about like our baseline axiological assumptions that we bring to the table. We're all bringing our own axiological assumptions, and if that's the one that you bring and that's the one that I bring, it's like how do we advance from there? I haven't seen.
I mean, like the idea that like Martin Luther King having a theater for a decent speech in response to suffering justifies every single instance of suffering permitted by like racism in the world. Just seems to me like completely insane, like completely. I don't understand how anyone can have that view, right? Like it's seems to me that when most morally sensitive people reflect on their moral beliefs, that this isn't the kind of view that they come to, right? Like, I don't know, like maybe Cameron is being serious and that is his view, but I'm very sort of suspicious of that, because it seems to me a view that can only be like derived from like specifically trying to defend Christianity from like the problem of evil. Like it just seems to me like a crazy view. Like I don't know, like maybe I'm maybe there's something I'm not seeing here, but like I don't know. It just seems crazy to me.
And I don't really see a way. I'm curious what your thoughts are on.
Yeah, I mean,
what I'm trying to convey here.
I mean, at bottom, it might just be a clash of intuitions. I mean, I tend to think that lots of philosophy is based, lots of actually reasoning in general, including scientific reasoning, bottoms out in kind of seemings, things like that, like things seem to be the case, or things appear to be the case. And sometimes those can come in conflict when you're in these sorts of dialectical contexts. And it's really difficult to know how to progress from there when two people kind of disagree with respect to their basic seeming.
Can we go back a little bit, Alex? So
yeah, there's a lot of problems when it comes to disagreement and diverging intuitions. I guess there's not really a whole lot I can say to Cameron's point here, other than it just seems completely crazy to me. And I guess a further point I can make is that maybe we can like have further evidence on what like other people's intuitions are. Like if we did like a poll, on, like people's like genuine seemings, like if we were to actually have access to people's like genuine like intellectual seemings, and more people had the genuine intellectual seeming that a world with Martin Luther King and every single instance of like racism and suffering we see in the world is all things considered better, then maybe that would like do more to support like Cameron's point here. But based on like my experience, and I've actually asked a few people about this, like, do you think a world where a father's daughter is like raped and murdered in a brutal way, but then the good is like later exemplified in a world where the father is able to like forgive the rapist of his deed, and there's this good of forgiveness and compassion that is exemplified in the world? Do you think that world is all things considered better than the world with where the rape did not occur and the father never got a chance to like have this theater for like sort of virtue development in terms of like forgiving the perpetrator? And most people I ask this question agree that the world where the rape doesn't happen in the first place is all things considered better. And I think that it's like it strikes me as plausible that that's probably going to be like the view of most people, right? And certainly my view. Like it seems crazy to me that the view that the that the rape happening is all things considered better. Like, it just seems to me completely insane and doesn't seem to be taking seriously enough the kind of suffering and damage and trauma that goes into rape, like not just for the father but for like multiple people involved. Like, it just seems to me like this overwhelming bad. um so I don't know, like, it just strikes me as a crazy view, but like I don't really have much else to say here.
The formulation of the problem of evil you find most pressing, is it to you that it is a logical contradiction between God's existence and the world, or that it just makes God's existence highly improbable?
I think it's more the
So
latter.
now we're going to get into the evidential versus logical problem of evil. I've said this in some of my previous videos, but I actually defend both a logical and an evidential problem of evil. Yeah, I defend both, but I think for like dialectical purposes, it's a lot easier to discuss an evidential version because there's a lot of stuff that gets involved into like trying to defend a logical version. A lot of commitments of theism that need to be established. Just a lot of fluff. I do think ultimately in the end a logical problem of evil works, but I think it's a lot easier to and straightforward and overall convincing to get into an evidential version. That's my view, though.
Latter.
Improbable.
I'm a little suspicious of the distinction here. When people try to distinguish between the logical and evidential problem of evil, they'll say, if you have a logical problem of evil that says something like, if there is a God, there would be no suffering, there is suffering, therefore there is no God. People say this argument is dead in the water because as long as it's logically possible that God has some reason, like morally sufficient.
Yeah. Well, the argument that argument that Cosmic Skeptic or Alex O'Connor brought up is pretty crap as it stands. Like, if there is no God, then there is no suffering. Like, I don't see why any theist would accept that. Like, I don't see that at all. Like, at least if you say if you make the premise something like if there is a God, then there is no evil in the world. At least, like, with evil, you have like a normatively laden concept, and the premise has some more plausibility there. But like, if there is a God, then there is no suffering in the world. I don't see how that premise would have any plausibility at all for the theist. So the argument that he laid out right there just seems like crap.
Reason to bring about evil, the argument fails. In other words, if one of the premises is not, it's logically possible for one of the premises to be false, then it's not really a logical argument you're putting forward, but an evidential one. But imagine if someone put forward the Kalam cosmological argument and said this is a logical argument, a valid syllogism. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And I said, but that's not really a logical argument, because as long as it's logically possible that the universe didn't have a beginning, as long as it's logically possible that something can begin without a cause.
Okay, so I see what he's saying here, but I think a better way to sort of cash out the distinction between the logical and evidential problem of evil is that the logical problem of evil seeks to establish that there is a contradiction from a set of propositions that are either necessarily true or commitments of theism, or sort of logical entailments of said propositions. That there's a contradiction that you can derive from such propositions for theism. Like, there's an actual like contradiction in the theist commitments and the existence of evil in the world. Like, there's a contradiction here. It's logically impossible for this specific set of propositions to be the case, right? It's not that there's like this premise that all the premises have to be logically necessary. It's that given the theist commitments and the existence of evil in the world, and presumably you can add like a bunch of other like premises related to theist commitments, such as God's being morally perfect, God's being maximally free, God's being priorly pure prior to creation, and that's what I do in my personal version of the logical problem of evil. Basically, you get a set of propositions and you derive a contradiction from it. The propositions jointly entail a contradiction. That's what I take to be a logical problem of evil. Whereas an evidential problem of evil, there's going to be a set of propositions such as like the existence of evil, and God's properties, commitments of theism, which jointly entail the high improbability of God's existence. Like, God's existence is highly, highly, highly unlikely. So the difference would be one is a contradiction and one is that theism is highly, highly unlikely.
Then the argument's dead in the water. So you shouldn't really be advocating a logical kalam, but rather an evidential kalam. But that just seems like a weird distinction to make. And I feel like people do it unfairly with the problem of evil, but not with any other deductive argument that
I don't know
exists.
if it goes exactly like.
So the kalam is a deductive argument in the sense that like you can't like deny the conclusion if you accept both premises. Like, both premises entail the conclusion, right? It's just an entailment from the premises. But it's also like in terms of like establishing the premises, the argument for the premises. A lot of the arguments are going to be a posteriori. So, for example, for premise two, a lot of Craig's arguments are going to be scientific, like sort of empirical arguments that relate to like Big Bang cosmology, certain models in physics. But also, there's going to be a lot of a priori considerations, such as the impossibility of actual infinites and stuff like that, which argues that the denial of the premise is metaphysically impossible. So the kalam is a bit of a weird one. Like it depends exactly how you argue for the premises, whether it ends up being more of like just an inductive sort of consideration or an inductive argument for God's existence, or if it ends up being like establishing God's existence with near certainty. It depends on your strategy for like arguing for the premises, basically.
Like that, because it seems to me like I've encountered when I've heard your discussions about the problem of evil, it sounds like you've said things like, I understand how people could see where free will would be a reason God would tolerate evil among humans or something like that, but then why do animals suffer in such and such way?
Yes.
And that seems to insinuate that you could have some evils, that there's not a logical contradiction there, as opposed to God. Well, there's a lot of different logical arguments trying to say that God doesn't exist. They'd be incompatible properties, things like that. But it seems like you're saying it's just like, well, yeah, I can see a world where there's evil at this threshold, but not at this threshold, and that's more the evidential. It seems like to me.
I'm not sure, because you could just pull out a logical version. You could
I'm not sure that that's right. I'm not sure if his characterization is right. I think it's just the distinction is, one is trying to say that there's a contradiction jointly entailed from theist commitments, and the other is saying that there's a high improbability of God's existence jointly entailed from the existence of evil in the world, plus theism and theist commitments.
Instance that the existence of suffering does not. There's no kind of logical syllogism I would use just from the existence of suffering alone to rule out God's existence. But maybe I could formulate if I said.
All right, I think I should be louder now, hopefully.
Well, God would tolerate human evil for free will, but not animal suffering. Then I could just formulate a logical problem of evil that specifically focuses on animal suffering. Okay. It would still be a valid argument. It would still be a formal, logical syllogism. The fact that it's kind of more specified.
Yeah, I don't think it has to do with like formal validity. I think it has to do with like what I said earlier. But at this point, I'm just repeating myself, so I'll just continue the video.
Or allows for the existence of other forms of unrelated suffering. It seems irrelevant to me.
Let's say this. So Trent Doherty, his view is basically he doesn't like the distinction either, and he's like one of the most premier philosophers that's working on the problem of evil. He's a Catholic, so
I'll let you explain. But
he thinks.
Go ahead.
So he thinks that. So basically, there's two premises to the argument. He does have that view, but that's not what I'm talking about now.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
We'll
what I'm talking about now is that the logical version and the evidential version.
I don't know what he said. I don't know what he whispered there. So, but we'll just keep going.
Are basically very similar. So the first one, the first premise is basically a theological claim about what would exist if God exists, and then the second one is the evidential claim about whether or not there's this type of suffering in the world. So like evil exists or animal suffering exists. And in the logical version, the evidential version, it involves both the theological claim and then the evidential claim. So he thinks that the distinction collapses too. It's just like whatever specific theological claim you happen to be focusing on at this time is I kind of agree with that. I kind of think that the distinction between the logical and the evidential version.
You know what it seems to me, if I can be frank, is it seems to me that somebody will kind of present a logical problem of evil, and in the context of a discussion or a debate where somebody is trying to argue against an atheist, they try to kind of, they say like, well, are you making a logical version or an evidential version? And they kind of get them on the back foot thinking, well, I guess it's logically possible that God could have morally sufficient reason. And they're like, well, then you're not making as strong a claim as you thought you were. It seems like kind of a useful rhetorical tool for the theist, but if you actually like pay close attention to the conversation that's taking place, as you say, Cameron, I think the distinction is actually it collapses. It's not really it's not a helpful one. It's only helpful instrumentally to winning a conversation.
Now I want to like play moderator and be like, Trent, is that what you were trying to do?
No. Well, I don't think that's what you were trying to do. I don't think that's what you're trying to do.
No,
I feel like that's how
I'm trying to wrap my head around. I do believe there is this distinction between one claim that any amount of evil whatsoever would show God does not exist versus particular kinds of quantity or quality of evil would make it unlikely. I do think there's a legitimate
there's a difference between those, but both of those could be called logical.
No, that's semantics, so that's fine.
But it's not semantics. It's the difference between a logical argument and like to say something's not a logical argument. It's kind of an evidential problem. It's not logical because it's logically possible that one of the premises is false. It seeks to undermine the logical validity of the argument.
The reason I asked for the distinction is because I believe.
I wish Joe would say something here. He probably has something to add.
That if the problem is a certain quality or quantity of evil, then that is subject to a criticism that can't be leveled against an argument that says any amount of evil would disprove God. Because the criticism would be this, that if an atheist says, yes, I could see how this amount of evil could be justifiable, but not this amount, one wonders, why can't the defenses for this amount be applied to the other amount? Whereas if you have someone who says, hey, it's all or none, that reply won't really work.
Well, it might kind of be like if the government came along and just flooded everybody's houses by just like pouring water into their front gardens and just absolutely flooding and destroying their property. And you said that like this is ridiculous. Obviously the government is trying somehow to cause riots or something. And somebody said, well now hold on, like I mean, if the government were to install a sprinkler system that like watered your garden, you think this was fine, right? And it's like, yes. And you say, well look, so now your argument isn't so much that it's like it's some real like absolute incompatibility between a good government and flooding your house. Because you're saying, you know, you're allowing the government to put a little bit of water onto your garden, but if it's this much, then that's too. But like, it just seems like a weird line to take. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, I mean, there's robust versions of the evidential problem. That I agree with you that if somebody basically says the logical problem of evil doesn't work, and then they kind of ignore the other arguments for an evidential problem, then that's problematic. But then it'll come back down to, though, in different intuitions, when certain things are allowable, what can we foresee? And I think it's a bit more than that because yeah, I'd love to get to drill down a little bit, especially your concerns seem to be, and you seem to have reaffirmed this previously. I don't want to talk too much. I want to hear what Joe says too, and Cam. That I would think that if the concern is primarily about non-human suffering, I wonder if there's a way to apply the justifications for human suffering in these different ways. I guess that's what I would look at to be most promising. But if you think human suffering is also pointless, then we're kind of back at square one.
I think that would be good to discuss. I think one thing to say is that I think we would all agree, I'm not sure, but that an argument, a problem of evil argument that says something like any amount of evil and suffering whatsoever is logically incompatible with God is a bad argument. It's not going to work.
It's not super popular. But there's people who
there are people who say that, but I think everybody here
would
would probably think that would be a bad argument. I mean, for myself, I think when I say like a logical problem of evil, I think maybe that there's a confusion here because you seem to be defining the logical problem of evil as the view that any amount of evil and suffering is incompatible with God.
I think that's pretty traditional.
Maybe I guess it's if that's what people are calling it, maybe I should change my terminology here, because when I talk about the difference between a logical and an evidential problem, I mean to say that there are kind of versions of an argument that don't say any amount of evil and suffering is incompatible, but
I get what you're saying. You're basically
it's still like a logical argument.
Some versions of the problem of evil just focus on a particular range of facts or a particular range of kinds of evil, and then you can go on to say of those that is incompatible with God's existence. So and that you could probably classify that as a logical argument from evil. But instead of getting bogged down in the terminology, we might just want to lay out a particular version of the argument from evil and then just discuss that. So I figured I could probably start with that. I could offer maybe just a pretty intuitive kind of Bayesian argument from evolutionary animal suffering. So we're not going to get into the fancy Bayes machine goes further. We're not going to do that. But let's just think. I mean, under a perfect being hypothesis, at least by my lights, it just seems really surprising that God would use in his very creative act this process, which is just rife with suffering and languishing and death and predation and parasitism. You know, nature bends tooth and claw. Organisms are ripping each other to shreds, and this is just like built into natural selection. This is built into the very process. Just this death and destruction and suffering and so on is built into the very means, the very fabric of creation. It seems from the get-go. It seems, and that just seems like a really surprising way. We wouldn't predict that. Just a priori from the armchair. Would we predict a perfect being to bring about, let's say, humans and other sentient creatures by means of the process, which is fraught with this kind of suffering, this almost horrendous evil, and not just any horrendous evil, but hundreds of millions of years of this kind of evil. I mean, I remember, just to make this point, last note, it was 2020, there were these fires in Australia, and tens of thousands of koalas were burned alive. Now that's just Australia, that's koalas. These koalas are suffering, being burned alive. That's just Australia, just a few weeks of forest fires. Think about the whole world now, not just Australia. Don't now just think about a few weeks, think about a few years. Now think about tens of thousands of years, now tens of millions of years, now how about hundreds of millions of years? It's mind-boggling. And so that just, by my lights, it just seems surprising on theism. Whereas on a view where, I guess we should just say natural reality is indifferent to the flourishing and languishing of sentient creatures, that's not as surprising. Nature's red tooth and claw. There's nothing down there that cares about the flourishing of sentient creatures. So, given that it's surprising on one hypothesis and nowhere near as surprising on another, we would have some evidence for the hypothesis on which it isn't surprising. So that's an argument that we could consider.
And I think it's worth. I mean, it's worth talking.
Yep. What Joe Schmid basically laid out is basically a sort of basic probabilistic argument from evil that I think is sound, and there's also like a million other like routes you can take it. You can also like take another sort of drip period route and basically ask what the probability of like the specific link between pain and pleasure and reproductive success would be under theism, as opposed to like under like, and you'd add both natural selection both to the our background information in terms of theism and atheism, or theism and naturalism, whatever, what have you, or hypothesis of indifference. So given unguided natural selection, it seems to be exactly what we expect, that pain and pleasure would operate as any other sort of like mechanism and for reproductive success and survival benefits, right? Like that's exactly what we'd expect, given sort of unguided natural selection, right? Since all our other physical biological states, the shape of our organs and the shape of our genitalia, everything else, every single other like biological fact about us, via natural selection is like developed through benefit for like some survival benefit or some sort of benefit with respect to reproductive success. So, given unguided natural selection plus some sort of hypothesis of indifference or naturalism, um, we would expect exactly that, um, that pain and pleasure would also be tied to reproductive success or survival benefits, right? That's exactly what we would expect. Whereas given theism, the pain and pleasure of humans is something that has moral value, right? So we would expect, at least it's like more plausible given theism, that God would treat pain and pleasure different from just any other old, sort of biological mechanism, right? Because humans have moral value in theism. God created humans in order to develop a relationship with them and to love them, right? Um, and so humans can reciprocate their love for God, right? Humans have moral value on theism, and God created humans specifically to like enhance the world's moral value on like certain views of theism. So pain and pleasure would be states that have moral value on theism, right? So we would expect God to treat pain and pleasure differently, like right. It would be incredible in theism if God's moral reasons happen to align with linking pain and pleasure with reproductive success, right? Pain and pleasure being tied to reproductive benefits, right? Or functioning as just any other sort of biological or systematic role in, natural selection, right? Like this would be surprising on theism, right? We would expect God to treat pain and pleasure differently. So that's one point, and this is the sort of Draperian argument. And there's there's a whole slew of probabilistic arguments. There's Robert Bass's paper on inscrutable evils. There's Michael Tooley's argument, there being four possibilities, and the right-making and wrong-making properties, like they either cancel each other out. The wrong-making properties outweigh the right-making properties. The right-making properties, unknown right-making properties outweigh the unknown wrong-making properties. Or there are no unknown wrong-making or right-making properties, and the evil is exactly as evil as we'd expect it to be. And there's these four possibilities, and given no further evidence, we would have no reason to think that any one of these possibilities for any given inscrutable evil is more probable than the other. So we would be justified in assigning a 1 in 4 probability to a given inscrutable evil being all things considered justified, right? Because the only case in which an inscrutable evil would be all things considered justified is if there's unknown right-making properties that outweigh any unknown wrong-making properties there might be, right? That's the only possibility under which the inscrutable evil is all things considered justified. And given we have no evidence to favor that possibility over any of the other four possibilities, there's going to be at least a 1 in 4 possibility, minimally, or maximally, I'd say, a 1 in 4 possibility that any given inscrutable evil is all things considered justified. And then that's just one inscrutable evil. So when we look at a vast array of inscrutable evils, the frequency distribution, the moral randomness of evils, animal suffering, human suffering, children being raped, children getting horrific skin diseases such as that butterfly disease, something bullosa or something. Which is like a horrific skin disease that causes extreme pain to an infant. And there's like all these instances of suffering we see in the world, and each of them we can like call inscrutable suffering. Like we don't know the reasons behind why God would permit them, and so we have like a 1 in 4 chance that each instance of suffering is all things considered justified. Then when we like add these 1 in 4 chance, we keep adding them on top of each other and stacking the improbability up. We get that the probability that every single instance of inscrutable evil is justified is just extraordinarily low, extremely low. Like so, this would be another way of framing a sort of inductive argument from evil, not just animal suffering, but just the set of all evils we see in the world. And when we look at like the set of all evils we see in the world, especially particularly horrendous evils, and certain features we see of the evils, then we get like an extreme probability of God's existence, and we could stack that on top of like just Joe's sort of general argument from animal suffering, and we get like a lot of I would say a pretty good probabilistic case from evil to atheism.
talking about human suffering, but this argument works if we're just talking about non-humans. And you say kind of natural selection, it involves so much suffering, it relies upon it. As you say, it's the very machinery. Survival of the fittest entails death and destruction and suffering of the unfit. This is
Yes, and that's sort of like a Draperian argument as well, right? We would expect God to treat suffering differently, whereas on unguided natural selection, this is exactly what we'd expect. We'd expect survival and reproductive success to be tied to suffering, right? To suffering to function just as well as any other sort of function that biological creatures exhibit. That's exactly what we expect on unguided natural selection, right? Whereas with natural selection that's actively guided by an omnibenevolent, sort of perfectly good being, right? We wouldn't expect it to be just like treated just as any other role in reproduction, right? Like we would expect God to treat it differently. So that's the Draperian argument, and we can stack plenty of other problem of evils on top of that to create a high improbability of God's existence. I would say like extremely high improbability of God's existence, like extraordinarily, to the point where God's existence is like about as probable as stacking all the fine-tuning constants on top of each other, and like you know how like insanely improbable all the fine-tuning constants are, right? The kind of argument for fine-tuning that theists use in order to establish the high probability of God's existence. Well, we can stack all those constants on top of each other, and that's how improbable I would think the prior for theism is. In fact, I'd say it's possibly even more improbable than that. Like it's that ridiculous. It's that low of probability that God exists, given the evidential problem of evil. But like I've been talking about this for quite a while, so I'm just gonna let them continue now.
how it works. To me, I find this a compelling argument. I think it works. I think there are some complications when you talk about human beings, because there seems to be something else that could be said to be going on there. Certainly, just from a kind of coherent Christian picture that humans are special, they're ensouled, whatever it may be. But even on that account, humans evolved like what, a few million years ago. I mean, Homo sapiens have been around for a few 100,000 years. So you've still got hundreds of millions of years, as Joe says, of this suffering. To me, this is probably the strongest version of the problem of evil.
I have so many thoughts. I don't even. It's so difficult to know even where to begin.
Yeah.
In like.
So let's see what Cameron's response to this is. Let's go.
Thought is that like this formulation of the problem of evil has made me want to take Trent Doherty's approach to the problem of evil so seriously. Like I think that we may need, like, have to look at other resources in order to explain the data. So it's not just perfect being theism, it's also like these certain axiological assumptions, like these love manifesting virtues being so strong or being so valuable, but then also maybe combine that with the fact that animals will be resurrected in the afterlife, or there's some sort of afterlife for animals. I don't know. I think that...
I want them to be able to talk.
Yeah.
And sing.
Exactly.
Their suffering needs to be redeemed. I mean, I'm really...
So I think theism does a lot better when you accept a sort of universalism, animal universalism. However, I still don't think it solves the problem of evil at all, right? Because there's still, because universalism and the animals going into heaven, that's just going to be a compensatory good, and it would be a mistake to think that a compensatory good, right, justifies the evil, right? Like compare two beings, right? One that permits a single instance of gratuitous suffering to befall his creation, and then compensates his creation with infinite benefits, and then compare that to another being who allows no instances of gratuitous suffering to befall his creation, and then compensates them with infinite benefits, right? And remember, gratuitous suffering here, and I should probably like clarify my terms here, but gratuitous suffering is going to be the kind of suffering that would be all things considered wrong to permit, right? That would be all things considered bad for God to allow, right? And we can imagine a single instance of gratuitous suffering, right? If God permits a single instance of gratuitous suffering, but then compensates his creatures with infinite benefits, well, then you can still imagine a better being, one that permits $0 of gratuitous suffering, and then compensates his creatures with infinite benefits. So, the idea that compensatory goods like heaven and Christian universalism, that solves the problem of evil, I think is mistaken. But let's see if there's any other further responses.
I mean, if I were a theist, I would definitely opt for probably Trent Doherty's approach. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's plausible.
Well,
but
I will say that, okay, I should probably, people who are listening, like, what we're doing is called inside baseball. When you sometimes drop a bunch of, like, names or things, and people are like, what are they referring to? Yeah. So, at least in the Catholic worldview, there's actually a variety of answers to the problem of animal suffering. The traditional Thomistic answer, there's two ways you can look at it. One is
All right, let's get into Thomism, boys.
that
And are we going to get into the privation of good stuff? Let's see.
animals do not suffer intensely, or they're suffering, allowing their suffering.
Yeah, that seems really implausible to me. Like I don't know. Like it seems to be that, like a lot like animals have a lot of the same sort of like they have like a central nervous system. They have pretty much all this. Like if when we open up an animal and look into their brain, they have pretty much all the same things that humans have in terms of like the relevance in terms of like pain states, right? And we can also like observe their behavior and stuff. Like there's like a million things here. There's like a shit ton of evidence that animals have like feel pain. We can observe their behavior. We can observe their response to stimulus, and we can like open up their brain and see that they have like the same sort of relevant states or the relevant like nervous system, opioid receptors. I think yeah, animals have opioid receptors. All those biological processes that we know cause pain in humans, right? We know through empirical tests that cause pain in humans, right? We have like we have shit tons of evidence that animals suffer, right? Like you'd have to basically appeal to some sort of like solipsism in order to deny that animals suffer. Like you'd have to take a pretty radical view in order to deny that, like that, which is going to end up being like extremely implausible. So I don't know, man. Like you're going to probably want to do something different than that.
It's not morally blameworthy. That's one view in the Thomistic tradition or the Cartesian tradition. Michael Murray would advocate that view in his book. So one view is that animal suffering, we're not morally blameworthy for causing it, or that it's not a significant evil to be concerned with. The other would be it is significant, but just as human suffering is significant, but animals could be compensated. It's not the traditional Catholic view, but it is allowed within Catholic theology. And so one version of that would be that animals who have a sense of
okay, the animals can be compensated, right? But compensatory, like I already mentioned this, compensatory goods don't justify permitting evil, right? If I steal your wallet, but then like I give you all your change back, right? It was still wrong for me to steal your wallet, right? Like compensatory goods don't justify actions, right? They just they make right they right wrongs, right? But like they don't justify, they don't make it the case that your action was good. Like it doesn't like that's not how compensatory goods work, right? So I think that this is just a mistaken objection, right? It would still be wrong for God to allow even a single instance of a gratuitous suffering to befall his creation if he rewards them with compensatory goods, right? It would still be wrong for God to do that, right? But maybe that wrong would be so little in comparison to the compensatory goods, right? But like it would still be wrong.
consciousness over time will experience happiness, fulfillment endlessly in an afterlife. If an animal has a capacity for conscious suffering over time, it stands to reason they can have a capacity for conscious happiness over time. And so God could still give them endless happiness. And some Catholics take that view. And then others like Trent Doherty add more, that God could even add goods to them.
They can be transformed.
Like by giving them what my friend Jimmy Akin calls a cognitive boost. Yeah. And so they might talk and I did laugh. I mean, I found it a little silly at first, reserving it. And I'm a bit warmer to the idea.
Yeah, there's like a couple problems with here. Like first would be like sure that this is going to be a stipulation you can add to theism to make it the case that there's going to be some higher plausibility of God's of God like creating animals and all this stuff. But like even if we grant that there's not really doesn't seem to be any like independent reason to stipulate this in theism unless you give like an actual argument to think that this is plausibly the case, that God that heaven exists and all that stuff. Like it just seems like you're tacking on an extra hypothesis to theism and like basically creating a sort of extended theism. Like another thing needs to be true. There needs to be this heaven where animals go and they'll talk. Like I don't know. Like it just seems to be like lowering the prior probability of theism, and there doesn't seem to be any independent justification for it outside of this response to the problem of evil, right? There doesn't seem to be any it just seems to be a sort of auxiliary assumption, right? That isn't really independently justified. So that's going to be another point in response to this. To this argument.
I could see that more with the fate of domestic animals versus necessarily wild animals. But so those are two different approaches. And then one I think is worth considering though. I think and I think Joe, you laid it out really well in a robust way to get us with the heart and the head on it. I worry about some of the we have to be careful with some of the assumptions built into the argument a bit. First, for the vast majority of evolutionary history, I don't think animals were sentient. We have like invertebrates and things like that, but it's still millions of years.
Yeah,
sure.
well, definitely.
Hundreds of millions.
Hundreds.
So I nearly said billions,
It's
but
definitely
then
not
I
billions.
decided not to say that
it's not.
because,
But the other
because
one
the life has been on Earth for
Yes,
billions of
life
years,
is billions,
but
but
the kind of
came into
the kind of
But let me
suffering,
ask you,
is
suppose in
hundreds
those
of
billions of years, what if the percentage in an animal's existence, its life is either pleasurable, neutral, or painful? Because certain billions of years, there's going to be billions of years of pain, but there are also billions of years of pleasure and billions of years of neutral activity, like sleeping. So one must be careful not to prejudice this description, and it's just one horrific gore fest. I think we also look at the realistic lives of animals and then ask, well, is their existence themselves good? And I guess I gave you a thought experiment in our debate, and here's another one that might be more realistic, actually, than the one I gave you in our debate. Would it be wrong for us to send a probe with amino acids to a planet like Earth to start an evolutionary process there that normally would not have begun? And we start this evolutionary chain that will entail a lot of suffering. Now, one quick rejoinder to that is, well, Trent, like, we can't make, that's how we don't know how to make life aside from that. But God could certainly, snap his fingers and not use evolution. So that's the problem there. But I don't know if that's a great objection, because if something is just really bad, even if there's no other way to do it, you should still refrain. It'd be like, let's say I could raise an animal with an artificial womb, but the only technology we have, the animal will just suffer horribly every minute of its existence. And I would say, but this is the only way I can grow animals in artificial wombs. I'd say, well, then you just shouldn't do it at all. But if it wouldn't be bad for us to start an evolutionary history, maybe it's not so bad if God does it, even if he has other ways that he could do it. I don't know.
Before y'all come back on that, there's another.
Yeah, I mean, like, it just seems to me that like any good that God can obtain through evolutionary, creating animals through evolutionary history, could be obtained through God not permitting any of the suffering involved, right? So I'm not sure how plausible a response that is, right? Like God could, he could even create like organisms through long evolutionary history, but like he could like set up their psychophysical states in such a way that they don't experience this brutal amount of suffering that we have evidence that they do experience. So the plausibility of this response doesn't strike me as very plausible.
Analogy of like the Amazonian, what do you call it?
Ecosystem?
Ecosystem? No, the Amazonian ecosystem. If we had the technology, which we do, we could just completely wipe out the Amazon right now and all of the animals that are currently suffering and going through horrible predation and everything else that's going on in the Amazon right now. So, but like if suppose that there was a button that you could just press and you could get rid of it all, would you press the button?
Well, that's what Trent asked
that was
in our debate, because I was talking about why God would allow so much suffering, and we have to be careful here to notice that Joe made an argument from natural selection, right? Not so much just animal suffering, but specifically that the process of natural selection, the machinery by which God brings about creation, involves and necessitates suffering. So when you ask, would I press a button and kill every animal, or would I not? Like, I actually don't really know. But this isn't the situation that God is in. God has a button that he can press that takes all of the animals living in the Amazon and makes their life have 50% less suffering, 80% less suffering, and doesn't press it without having to kill them. That's the situation that God is in. So it's not an analogous situation.
We're embedded in the rules of a chess game that's already been laid down, as it were, and we're kind of having to operate within those rules. But we're not the very author of the chess game itself and the rules by which it operates.
Yes.
If we were, I mean.
But I worry about the feasibility, though, because I see the objection, but even when you articulate, well, why wouldn't God decrease suffering by 50 or 80%? I'm not sure exactly what that means. Like, you could get rid of half of all animals. That would decrease the suffering by 50%. You could dull their senses by 50 or 80%. But then could they function? Because I see your concern, Joe, like, well, God's making the rules of the game. But it could be the case.
I don't see why they wouldn't be able to function. Like, it seems logically, like God could do all things logically or metaphysically possible, right? It seems logically and metaphysically possible that God could have created animals that are still like fully functioning with different sort of psychophysical states, right? Different sort of psychophysical states linked with environmental or external stimulus, right? Such that being inducing certain like levels of what would be in these organisms pain, like the opioid receptors causing pain in the animals. You can imagine God creating like different physical states that don't link pain, that don't link these psychophysical states and these opioid receptors with the experience of pain, which we take to be intrinsically bad. So it doesn't seem to entail that the animal won't function either. Like God could have created an entirely different organism with a different sort of biological structure, different sort of psychophysical states, right? So I guess like what I would say is that I don't understand this response. Like I don't understand like how this follows at all.
That creating animal life has these necessary elements in it, provided God does not excessively interfere with the system itself. So for example, I mean, suppose it wasn't evolution. Suppose God created all animals in their final forms, like they are today, and they existed for billions of years and never underwent evolutionary change. It seems like the problem would still remain. You'd have predation, you'd have disease, you would still have all those bad things. There's just no evolutionary mechanism. It's just kind of
Yeah, but God could have like created the like he again. Seems to be like sort of missing Joe's point, right? God could have created the world in such a way where predation, isn't really necessary, right? Like, God could have created the world where different psychological states and human animals have different biological structures. There's not as much pain involved. There's not as much suffering involved. Like I don't see why God being omnipotent couldn't do that, right? Like, presumably you accept that God's omnipotent and He can do all things logically possible. Is there a logical contradiction in God creating different physical laws that link different stimulus to different like psychological states? Doesn't seem to me like for example, God could have created a world where I get pricked by a pin and this causes me, pleasure instead of pain. Like there's a million things God could have done here that didn't result in the amount of suffering we see. Like there's a billion trillion things that God could have done here, like being omnipotent. God created all the physical laws. God created, presumably, like on a lot of views, God created all the causal laws itself too. Again, I don't really think that view is coherent, like creating all causal laws, but like there's that too. And given that, like God could have linked different causes to different effects, right? Like God, like there could be no sort of cause that would bring about the kind of pain we'd see. There's like a million things God could have done, right? So I'm not understanding this objection at all.
always been. It seems like there's something more direct about animal life that is the problem here.
I guess it depends what specifically we're thinking about. I mean, there are different things to disentangle here. Are we focusing on, is it the fact that God used this almost like as a means by which to bring about creatures? And, it seems as though he's maybe intending, maybe foreseeing but not intending, But is that what we're focusing on, or are we focusing on just the suffering inherent in the process? Is it God's directing of the process that's the problem? The way that I see it, it's just a matter of prediction. So, okay, maybe there are these necessary connections, maybe, but conceivably, systemically, it definitely could be another one. Maybe they just have some sort of built-in anesthetic, such that when the zebra just gets the claw from, or whatever, gets like the teeth from the lion, some sort of built-in anesthetic, like, I don't know, there's some sort of psychophysical law that just kicks in, and they don't feel any suffering, but
exactly.
The lion can still have it.
Exactly, yeah, that's exactly my point.
But here's where my problem comes. I noticed I had the qualifier that God does not excessively interfere in the system.
Well, these are psychophysical laws built in from the get-go.
Yeah,
No,
exactly. They God wouldn't need to interfere. Like God would have just created different laws and let them do their thing, and there wouldn't be as much suffering.
Because normally when an animal experience, any of us, we're animals, when we experience pain, it motivates us to act in an extremely aggressive way to promote our own survival. So what if in some circumstances when an animal is attacked, that immense amount of pain is what allows it to escape the attack and then to go on living? And so,
Again, God's omnipotent. So you're like, I think that this objection is basically another instance of like not using your imagination of what like an omnipotent being can do. Like God could have made it so that humans have like this natural built-in tendency to avoid cases where that they would need to survive, or even like made it so that there's different like sort of physical state laws that they wouldn't even need to like avoid, or wouldn't need to like sort of avoid certain pressures in order to survive, right? Like there's like a billion things God could have done here. Like again, this just seems to be a case of lack of imagination, right? Sorry, let me actually go back and watch this again, because there was something else I was going to say too.
to promote our own survival. So what if in some circumstances when an animal is attacked, that immense amount of pain is what allows it to escape the
Yeah, and another thing is that I don't think that God would need to like make it so that pain is necessary in order to motivate animals or humans to survive. God could have built in this sort of tendency for animals to have, or humans to have, motivation to survive. Right? God could have built in this tendency from the get-go that animals have, that humans have this sort of innate motivational pressure to survive, right? Without like all this pain. Like there's nothing logically necessary. There's no logically necessary connection here. Like there's no contradiction in between humans having this motivational tendency without the pain being involved, right? At least it seems to me that it could have been otherwise, right? As Joe said. So I'm not seeing how this has any force whatsoever. It just seems to be like misunderstanding or like underestimating God's power or omnipotence.
the attack and then to go on living. And so then you say, well, maybe there's a psychosocial law where the animal doesn't feel pain when there is no possibility for escape. It's like, but there's no real biological mechanism. It would seem like God would end up
God
having
is an omnipotent being.
But that's, I think,
Yeah, but then he'd be interfering.
Exactly.
that's my point.
He
Is
could have set it up differently from the get-go, different rules.
what I'm saying is God
Exactly.
creating a
Exactly. I don't say, like, Joe's right. Like, I don't see how Transpoint does anything here.
natural system will inevitably entail things that are more or less perfect in competition with each other. I worry that the concept of animal, that you know, pain, for example, like God could create animals. You know, instead of having pain, what if we just had a heads-up display that told us hand is burning, move hand? Well, a lot of us would ignore the heads-up display, and our hand would become useless. You know.
No, not if God has a built-in tendency that functions similar to how pain motivates us to avoid putting our hand on hot stoves, but doesn't involve the actual undesirable sensation entailed by having pain. Right? It seems completely logically possible that God could have done that. I don't understand how this objection works at all.
So this seems to be, what I worry, the parallel here would be like, well, why can't God make people that are free but don't do evil? We qualify humans so much they're not really human or free anymore. Why can't God make animals that don't suffer in a natural ecosystem? It gets changed and qualified so much they're not really animals. They're more like furry robots that God's like sending.
I don't see how that's entailed at all. Like, you can imagine like there being a function that works exactly like pain, except it doesn't entail like the sort of undesirable sensations. Like I don't see how God programming certain because again, pain works as a certain like function in response to inputs as well, right? Like, or at least you can analogize it that way, right? I get my hand pinpricked, and this causes stimulus, which creates the like which flows through my nerves and starts like sending signals to my brain, or my opioid receptors start sending signals to my brain or whatever, like however it works. I don't know how biology works. Leave me alone. But yeah, like you can imagine like this is basically a whole functional process that goes into like pain, and you can imagine God creating a different functional process that works similar to pain but doesn't entail the sort of undesirable sensations that pain entails. So I'm not seeing like both are going to be functional processes that work in similar ways, right? One's a built-in motivational tendency that doesn't entail the undesirable sensations, and that's pretty much the only difference, right? Like I don't see like both are going to be like responses to like functional inputs and outputs, right? I don't understand how it's any different, and how God's omnipotence couldn't have created beings in such a way that this works out and there's no pain. Like I don't get it. I don't get how this objection has any force, or this response has any force.
Around. That's my concern.
Well, to me, it seems almost like a limitation of imagination. I mean, we just
Exactly. Based Joe. This
is an epistemic argument, so I don't need to say that these are actually metaphysical possibilities. But so long as I can, so long as they're epistemically open, so long as I can conceive of these various other ways that reality could have been, we can factor that into our Bayesian analysis. And it really seems as though God could have set up psychophysical laws that really are highly finely tuned in this sort of way, where they're
Exactly. Bam. And I haven't even watched this video before, but like this like he's basically doing the exact same objection that I would make here.
I mean, not as infallible foreknowledge of the various ways that things are going to go on. Surely he could have this precisely fine-tuned psychophysical laws that
I'm so proud of myself for preempting Joe's objection here.
connect the suffering states that the organisms are in and their physical states, where it is actually privy to whether or not they're going to survive and so on. And okay, even if that makes them different than the animals that we do in fact have, my point then would just be why not create, rather, I won't put this as a question because questions aren't arguments. My point is it's more surprising that God created animals as we see them rather than animal star, like the ones that we were describing in this other epistemically possible scenario.
Exactly. Like animal star being animals that have built-in motivational tendencies to survive without the sort of undesirable sensations entailed from pain.
That would be more expected under theism, the animals star, than we see animals.
Exactly.
Would you be-
Like, if you want to be semantic and like say that like if they don't experience pain then that's not animals, well, okay, sure, but like why couldn't we have animal stars instead? Yeah, exactly.
I'm curious if your eyes will roll or your response would be to a defense saying, how do we know animal star doesn't exist right now?
Yeah,
because it's very
Oh my god. Okay, again, there's a lot of reason to think that animals feel pain. Like a lot of evidence. You'd have to basically be appealing to solipsism in order to deny it. Yeah, like there's basically no way, like based on the current empirical knowledge, there's basically no way it can be true that we're living in a world with animal stars instead of like animals, right? At least based on our like probabilistic or scientific evidence that we have right now. Like it just seems completely implausible. So, yeah, I don't know what else to say here. Like, I mean, if you want to be a solipsist about animal pain, I guess you can be, but like, um, I don't know. Like, you're probably gonna want to look for a better response than that. Like, because I don't know.
Difficult to determine the inner lives of anything, much
I
less
mean,
animals.
sure, like you can say it's logically possible that animals are pea zombies, but that would also apply to like other minds in general, right? But like, surely we can have like probabilistic evidence that animals can experience similar states to humans by looking at their internal organs, their nervous system, observing their behavior and their response to like negative stimuli. I don't know what else. I don't know what else to say here. Like, it just seems completely implausible that animals don't suffer. I don't know what else to say here. Like, just this response just strikes me as um, pretty silly, if anything. Uh, Hold on one second. All right, I'm back. Um,
True, that's true.
And there is
we'll just continue. Basically, yeah. Um, like the only way to make this response have any plausibility is to basically be a solipsist about animal pain, or to be a solipsist about the problem of other minds, right? Because we have at least close to as much evidence as that humans feel pain as we do that animals feel pain. Like, you would basically have to appeal to um, some kind of like extreme skepticism, some almost like global skepticism, in order to like deny it. Like, it would be like ridiculous, like the extent to which you would have to be skeptical in order to deny that animals have pain. Like, it's just, we have so much evidence that animals feel pain. And like, sure, like there's some evidence that animals aren't self-aware. Like, there might be a mistake that you'd be making here, that in terms of like animals don't have beliefs or like second order beliefs in the same way that humans do. That therefore like animals aren't sentient. But self-awareness does not require sentience. It's not necessary for sentience. Um, and we like, again, I cannot stress this enough. We have shit tons of empirical evidence, evidentiary evidence that animals can experience pain. Like, we have animal behavior, um, reaction to certain like inputs to like negative stimuli, like when we see an animal cut its leg up, we see its like suffering reaction. So when we observed animal behavior, that's seems to be exactly what we would expect if animals could actually feel pain. And we know that animals, or non-human animals, I should say, have the exact type of neural circuits present in the brains of humans when they experience pain. And we know that they have a nervous system and opioid receptors. So there's just like, and you could probably even stack more evidence on top of that. Like, the evidence that animals feel are sentient, like at least like some of the more intelligent animals, like dogs or pigs and cows and stuff, is just extraordinary. Like, it's high up there. Like, it's just extraordinary amount of evidence, to the point where it's just ridiculous to say that animals don't experience suffering, right? It's just like, you'd have to be like in denial of reality to believe that at this point. Of course, you can't prove it with certainty, right? Of course, there's always going to be some logical possibility of some skeptical scenario, but like, it's not plausible at all that animals don't suffer.
some, and I like risk being taken the wrong way here
Yeah.
when I explain this, but there are like, when I've seen videos of like animals being like ripped apart, like on Reddit and stuff, just
Nature
randomly, like a nature channel, and it's something like, it's actually very strange. Like, sometimes you'll look at the animal and they look peaceful, like they're being ripped apart, and they're just like sitting there like this, just like getting their leg like ripped off.
Well, I mean, on a lot of those videos, the animal is put out on drugs, like they're put out on some sort of anesthetic. Like, I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure what videos he's looking for, but I'm gonna guess if the animal, because if you look at most cases of animal suffering, especially in the wild, like I've seen a video of a Komodo dragon ripping apart and opening like a deer, and the deer was like screaming and crying in pain. Like, there's like numerous instances of animals acting in exactly the kind of way we'd expect they would act if they were experiencing horrific suffering, right? And and I'm pretty sure it's like a virtual consensus view that like when scientists observe animal behavior, that that there's evidence of suffering. Like I'm pretty sure. Like, I could probably I don't have access to like a survey or a sort of analysis or meta-analysis of like animal behavior or whatnot, but like I'm pretty sure, like based on my my admittedly limited understanding of the topic, that it's pretty much like a wide majority held view that animals suffer in response to suffering, right? And I don't know, like I haven't seen the kind of videos that Cameron put up, but like in terms of those videos, I'm pretty sure those mostly going to be the case that like the animal's going to be under some sort of anesthetic or some sort of like mind drug or something, like, because I know that that's what they often do in certain cases.
And it's weird. Like, so I don't know how.
Other times though, they definitely don't look peaceful.
I think,
so-
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Most of the time, like especially in the wild.
You
Yeah.
can find
Shock.
videos on the dodgier parts of the internet of human beings doing exactly the same
Yeah, I mean,
thing.
it is, but it is a good point that we have to consider now the philosophy of mind and how do we have access to the like mental states of others and so on. I mean,
Yeah, like we don't really have access to the mental states of others, but like, come on, animals feel pain. Don't be ridiculous.
potentially problematic aspect that God doesn't clue us into this fact that things suspiciously seem as though it's animals, not animals are. That might present problems of its own.
So a different approach to this whole Bayesian like argument from evil is, what about skeptical theism? I feel like we should at least discuss like skeptical theism. I mean, I'm not like the biggest fan.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with skeptical theism. I actually haven't touched on skeptical theism yet on this channel, and a lot of apologists aren't fans of skeptical theism, especially ones that are into theodicies and stuff and whatnot, aren't into skeptical theism. And there's a bunch of reasons why. There's like a skepticism worry, there's moral paralysis worries, but we'll get into that. Like see if they talk about that stuff.
Fan of skeptical theism. I mean, I guess it depends on the day, but it's like one of the most popular responses to the problem of evil is like, we really don't know what that probability is.
Yeah, in terms of like layman, like this is gonna be like a sort of popular layman response too. Like, I guess some laymen will say like free will, God gave us free choices, right? But I would say that the standard, like if you ask some random person on the street why God allows evil, they would say something like God works in mysterious ways. We don't know the reasons that God does what he does, but like there are reasons. I'm gonna guess that that's gonna be like the popular sort of layman response to the problem of evil. At least that's my intuition.
Of how likely the suffering in the world will be given theism.
Yeah.
We just don't know what that probability is, given the fact that God's knowledge is so much greater than our own, and there's we have these epistemic limitations on us and so forth. So what are y'all's thoughts on skeptical theism and how it relates to like Bayesian arguments from evil?
I think it's interesting. It's you need to be careful because it can turn into universal acid potentially, as you've pointed. Well, not.
I don't think I've ever heard Joe talk about skeptical theism before, to be honest with you. Maybe I have actually, but I don't think I remember.
Response to skeptical theism, but universal acid that you've talked about, like. If we're so epistemic in the dark about God's reasons for action and so on, like what's going to happen to the rest of natural theology, in order to run certain fine-tuning arguments?
Yep, exactly. This is exactly one of my objections too.
You need to be able to make
Days of Joe, Gummy and Clutch.
about what God would do or might do, and you need to make.
And I'm just gonna name drop again. John DePoe.
Yeah.
His positive skeptical theism is compatible with natural theology.
Can
We're using a lot of big
can I
terms.
suggest,
I
for
feel
the
like
sake of
John DeVoe. I've never heard of that guy, but yeah, like
people listening?
basically the idea that base Joe came in clutch to present is that if you present a version of skeptical theism, such as like here's a standard one, I think it's Bergen's. He provides like a set of skeptical principles that have to do with the entailment between goods and evils. I can't remember exactly what his skeptical principles are. In fact, I think I'm going to look it up right now. But I think one of them has to do with the entailment between goods and evils and the possibility of God's having reasons outside of our cognitive access. Hold on. Skeptical principle. I think it should be in the SCP, written by Trent Doherty. Cornea. Yeah, Cornea is another one that comes into skeptical worries. Look up Bergman. because I know that there's like ST1, ST2. I've read this in a bunch of books before. Yeah, there it is. There it is. Okay, so we have no good reason for thinking that the possible goods we know of are representative of the possible goods there are. God's justifying permitting inscrutable evils around us. We have no good reason for thinking that the possible evils we know of are representative of the possible evils there are. We have no good reason for thinking that the entailment relations we know of between possible goods and permission of possible evils are representative of the entailment relations between possible goods and permission of possible evils. We have no good reason for thinking that the total moral value or disvalue we perceive in complex states of affairs accurately reflect the total moral value or disvalue they really have. So basically, if you posit a sort of skeptical theism like this, there's a looming moral paralysis worry. But in addition to that, like if you want to use fine-tuning arguments, presumably, in order to motivate a fine-tuning argument, we have to have some access to like the reasons God would act on and what God would do, right? In order for theism to predict the data we see, the fine-tuning data we see, the life we see, like we have to, and this is what Richard Swinburne does, stipulate that it would be good for God to create humans, and obviously God would act on what he has reason to do, like what is good. He'd bring about good states of affairs. That's what we would expect God to do, all things considered, right? And since God has a reason has a reason to bring out good states of affairs, that's exactly what we would expect. That there to be a world with humans to have a loving relationship with God, because the good of God having a loving relationship with other creatures is something that needs to be instantiated in order for that good to be achieved. So basically, yeah, in order to get a fine-tuning argument off of the road, you have to stipulate something of God's desires and God's goals. Because if we start out a design hypothesis that's completely non-informative with respect to God's desires, then we're not going to really be able to make predictions, right? God's desires could be consistent with a coarsely tuned universe, a finely tuned universe, no universe at all, right? A universe made strictly out of cheese, right? A universe made strictly out of chocolate milk, right? If we don't have any specific inputs or like access to the desires that God has, then we have no reason to think that any specific universe is more consistent with what God wants than any other universe, right? So we need to have some access to God's desires and some reason to think that God would bring about the kind of universe that we see, basically. But if we don't have access to these reasons, right, the possible goods there are, the possible evils there are, and this gives us reason to think that we cannot be justified in believing that God would desire not to bring about certain evil states of affairs, then it seems to me that this same level of skepticism can be applied to the fine-tuning argument, and we have no reason to think that God's desires would be such that he would bring about the good of human life, right? Like you can say, oh, human life is good, therefore God would bring it about. Oh yeah, well we don't have no good reason to think the possible goods are representative of the possible goods there are. We have no reason to think that the possible evils are representative of the possible evils there are. We have no reason to think that the entailment relationships are representative of the entailment relationships they are. And so we can run this exact same skepticism against a sort of fine-tuning argument. And if the skepticism works in the case of the argument of evil and undermines our justifications there and undermines our inferences that we make there, then it'll work just as well in the case of a fine-tuning argument. And this applies to other skeptical theist principles we have, such as Cornea. It's way up here. Cornea, where are you? Okay. On the basis of cognized situation S, human H is entitled to claim it appears that P only if it is reasonable for H to believe that, given her cognitive faculties, and she has made use of them. Okay, blah, blah, blah. But basically, the basic idea is that the only way you'd be justified in believing, in affirming from the existence of what seems to be a gratuitous evil, or what seems to be evil, to the non-existence of God, is that if okay, it's hard to explain, but basically, you're only justified in thinking that an evil is, all things considered, gratuitous, that there's no justifying reason for the evil. If there were reasons, like if reasons did exist, we would expect to know them, right? So you can't judge that there are no reasons to permit the evil unless, if there were reasons, we would expect to know those reasons. The problem is this leads to a whole bunch of other skeptical worries about divine psychology as well. You can apply this to the fine-tuning argument as well, right? For example, like if God has good reason to create humans, right? if it seems to you that God has good reason to create humans, well, you're only justified in believing that creating humans is all things considered good if there were outweighing reasons that make it bad, all things considered, for God to create humans, that we would expect to know them. So since you don't have access to those reasons, and you wouldn't expect to have access to those reasons, if they existed, then you can't be justified in believing that God has good reason to create humans. So you can basically use these sort of skeptical theist principles to create these absurd skeptical scenarios for the theist in terms of divine psychology, and like it just create a bunch of really ridiculous skeptical scenarios for the theist that the theist won't be comfortable endorsing, basically, is what I'm getting at. So that's going to be the main problem with skeptical theism.
Can we just spell out
Yes.
what skeptical theism actually is?
Yes.
Because we've said it a few times.
Yeah, there are different versions.
I'll let you do it.
Yeah, there are different versions of skeptical theism. The most basic version is the one that your grandma gave. God's ways are mysterious, so basically. His ways are not our ways, so we shouldn't expect to be able to
That's
see
the
all.
layman one I brought up earlier. Again, I know it's pretty impressive that I'm predicting everything that they say here, but I genuinely have not watched this video before. I actually haven't. Like, trust me. Like, this is my first time actually like watching this video, but I'm actually preempting a lot of what's being said here.
All the reasons for which God acts. There are much more sophisticated ways, like the range of possible goods, evils, connections between obtaining states of affairs, and so on,
Now he's talking about Bergman's, which I opened up there.
of which we are aware, is not representative of the total range of goods, evils,
See, this is exactly what he's like saying. He's talking about Bergman's as well.
connections between goods and evils, and so on, that there are.
And I don't know if they're going to
Such
bring
that-
Cornea, because Cornea's like Stephen Weichtra's skeptical theist argument. Well, not really argument, but like that's basically his response to the Noahian infants brought forth by Word. That was the original skeptical theism, I should say. I don't know if that's going to be brought up, but that's another one.
That we wouldn't be able to conclude from our inability.
Or we don't know if our sample is
Yeah,
representative.
whether our samples are representative, such
Yeah.
that we can't justifiably conclude from our, let's say, not being able to see a good coming about from an evil, that there in fact is no such good, or that probably there is no such good, because the range of goods and evils and necessary connections among them and so on, that we are aware of, that's not representative of the total range that there is. So we wouldn't be justified in making that leap. So that, yeah, there are different ways to put it, and
So more or less we have an idea that there is some reason or justification for the existence of suffering, but even if there is such a reason or
we
explanation,
shouldn't expect to be able to see
it doesn't follow that we must be able to know what that reason is or to be able to comprehend that reason. This seems to me a good understanding of what skeptical theism is.
And what's difficult is that once you make that epistemic distance between us and God so large, you start to be able to, you tend to bleed into areas where you're not able to predict what God would do. I mean, will God sustain?
Yeah, this comes into like very deep issues with divine psychology. I actually think it runs a lot deeper than the fine-tuning argument. Like, for example, when interpreting God's scriptures, I take it that in order to interpret God's scriptures, we have to have some access or some background information to the kind of desires that God's likely to have, right? In order to rule in interpretations that are more consistent with God's desires and rule out interpretations that are more inconsistent with God's desires. So, in terms of like interpreting scripture, like I think that entire project is viciously damaged if we bring in skeptical theism. Like I think skeptical theism really damages our ability to reason about divine psychology really severely. Not only that, could we not reason about like fine-tuning argument, but you also have issues related to interpreting scripture, and on top of that, like it just makes theism an entirely impotent hypothesis, right? You can imagine theism being consistent with any number of states of affairs. Like it's equally consistent with the chocolate milk universe as it is with the this universe, right? It's like theism doesn't predict any other universe more than it does any other universe, right? Like in order for theism to make predictions, you have to know what states of affairs theism is likely to exclude, right? But this ability to exclude states of affairs from theism, or exclude states of affairs that are inconsistent with theism, you'd have to have some access to God's desires, right? Like this state of affairs is something that's less predicted on theism because God would not desire to bring it about. But if we're going to bring in skeptical theism and that we don't have access to God's reasons, or we don't have access to the kind of entailment relations between goods and evils, and this gives us reason to be skeptical of God's permitting evils, right? Then this is going to like really hurt our ability to reason about divine psychology. It's going to be the basic idea.
Suspend the laws of nature tomorrow? I mean, does he have a sufficiently? Maybe he has a morally sufficient reason to do that. I mean, after all, God's ways are infinitely greater than our ways. I mean, who are we? The range of reasons of which we're aware is not representative of the range of reasons that there are, and so on. As you pointed out, there are ways.
There's different versions
Yeah.
of
I
skeptical
I think that
theism.
might be a bit like potentially the biggest problem for skeptical theism is that of a kind of moral paralysis that it might bring.
And this is an objection that I sort of named earlier, but I haven't brought up. And I think that this is going to be another serious problem. Some philosophers have responses to moral paralysis, but I don't find them convincing. But let's see how they discuss this.
About that is, if if there is this suffering that exists, there are kind of deer getting caught under a fallen tree and starving to death, and starvation and predation and this kind of stuff. And we don't know what this reason is, but there is some reason that it's there. There is some good that it's serving. There is something about it that's justified. We run into a problem when it comes to trying to confront it or trying to change it. If we were in a situation where we have the opportunity to prevent an animal from suffering, if skeptical theism is telling us that, or indeed even a person, if skeptical theism tells us that, well, when you see some suffering, you should essentially assume that there is some good justification, you just don't know what it is. Then when I see, it's more difficult with a person, because I think Scripture quite, like for a Christian, they could say, well, we have revelation to tell us that you should be helping people from suffering.
And have a morally sufficient reason of which you're unaware
Yeah,
to allow
divine
certain,
deception.
to allow for certain.
Yeah, this is true. But so of course the problem that I'm getting at is that if when you are faced with evil, the skeptical theist says, when faced with evil and suffering, assume that there is a justification for why it's happening. You just don't know what it is. Then when I see some form of suffering and I have an opportunity to step in and prevent it, skeptical theism seems to say that I should actually refrain from.
Yeah. So basically, the idea is that for any like evil you see, if you sit back and let the evil happen, then that must have been what God intended, right? So you didn't really actually have a moral reason to prevent the evil. You didn't act wrongly in that case, right? Because God permitting, that evil was all things considered good, or God actualizing the state of affairs where you sit by and watch the evil happen was all things considered good. So you don't actually have a reason to prevent the evil, right? Because especially when we bring in considerations like Meissen brings up, that any evil that God allows must entail great benefits on the part of the sufferer, right? And I think that plausibly this is going to be the only case in which evil is justified, right? The only way God can justifiably bring up evil is if it entails great benefits on the part of the sufferer, right? Otherwise, he would be using the sufferer as a means to achieve other goods that are not related to the sufferer's, suffering, which seems to be a sort of deontic violation, as I brought up earlier. So any good God brings about is plausibly going to have to be entailing of greater benefits on the part of the sufferer. And if every evil we see entails great benefits on the part of the sufferer, then it seems to me that we don't have any actual reason to prevent evil, right? Like the only reason we would prevent a child from being burned to death is that we have reason to think that preventing the child from burning to death is a benefit for them. Like we'd be benefiting and we'd be helping the child out if we prevent them from being burned to death, right? However, if skeptical theism is true, and it's true that God only permits evil for the sake of great benefits on the part of the sufferer, then we actually wouldn't be benefiting the sufferer if we save them from being burned to death. We actually wouldn't be helping them out at all, right? We'd and paradoxically, the greater the suffering is of the sufferer, we have more reason on skeptical theism to believe that God would create great, or would achieve great benefits for them, or that they are entailing great benefits for the sufferer. We have the higher the degree of suffering is, we have greater reason to believe that they will receive great benefits. So in actuality, the greater the suffering is, we have less reason to actually intervene and prevent the suffering, which seems like completely at odds with our ordinary moral practice, right? And this is what I got from Stephen Meissen's paper, Ordinary Morality Implies Atheism, which is a good read. But yeah, this moral paralysis worry seems to really, really be extremely worrying. And I know that there's a million responses that theists have to it, but I think that the responses that skeptical theists have to the moral paralysis worry are ultimately unconvincing. But let's see if they bring them up.
Helping the drowning child in the pool or something, because, well, there's a justification as to why that's taking place. There's a greater good that it's serving, and by stepping in, if God wanted to allow that child to drown, he's got better understanding than I do of the situation, so why should I not allow the child?
Because given my cognitive limitations, and that I don't know, God has a greater good for allowing certain evils. Given my limitations, I cannot rule out the greater good is me being heroic and stopping the evils. Given my limitation and skeptical thing, I could say, you're right, I don't know. There could be a lot of greater goods. There could be ones I do or don't know. But one I seem to be aware of at this moment is the good of me ameliorating suffering. And since I am aware of that good and operating on a previous moral command, then it would follow. So I'm not as concerned about skeptical theism being this kind of acid. I do think that in addressing the problem of evil,
so yeah,
people who put forward easy solutions probably have...
Yeah, that's one response to the skeptical theist worry, which is that God, one of the things that could be the entailing greater good is you acting on your reasons and basically saving the child, and that could be the greater good that's entailed from the child burning. So there's a bit of a problem with this, and when we look into other analogies. So this is one that Stephen Meissen brings up as well, and this is also one that Bruce Russell brings up in one of his papers. Can't remember exactly which one. So imagine you have a tribesman, right? And you have like a doctor coming from the future to the past to save his dying son. So he cuts his son open, and tries to heal him up. He's from the future. From the tribeman's perspective, however, the surgeon is cutting his son open and like attacking his son and like hurting his son and like causing his son damage, right? Like breaking his skin and ripping him apart. So, given the reasons that the tribesman has in this scenario where he doesn't know that this is a surgeon from the future or what have you, the tribesman has reason to attack the surgeon and prevent him from hurting his son, right? Because as far as the tribesman knows, the surgeon is hurting his son, right? However, if the tribesman does know that this is a surgeon from the future, and that he's a reliable, he's trustworthy and he's telling the truth, and if the surgeon had reason to cut the son open and perform these techniques that the tribesman doesn't understand, right? If the surgeon starts doing that, then he wouldn't expect to know what the reasons the surgeon has for doing that. Like he wouldn't expect to know the techniques, the sort of technology the surgeon has. So he would actually have like a defeater for attacking the surgeon in this case, because he knows that the surgeon is acting in the son's best interests, and even though it seems odd to him that he's cutting the child open, he doesn't have a reason to stop the surgeon from doing that, because he knows that the surgeon is using really weird, strange medical techniques in the future that he wouldn't know about, and that he's acting ultimately in the son's best interest. So there is a paralysis worry in terms of the tribeman's case. Now, it seems to me that we actually have a similar worry in terms of skeptical theism, right? In terms of the in terms of like you sitting by and passively watching the child burning to death, right? It seems to me that that's going to be relevantly similar to the tribesman case. You know that this God exists, presumably. Like if you're a Christian, if you're a theist, and the skeptical theist worry comes true, you know that God exists and God has reasons for allowing the child to burn to death. So that if you sit by and allow the child to burn to death, God must have had a reason for allowing that. And if you and so like basically, I need to think straight right now. Basically, it would be like exactly like the surgeon, right? You know that God has access to these reasons that you couldn't possibly understand, and that if you had access to these reasons, like if you I'm really out of it right now. Sorry, I'm a bit tired. Let me actually try to think straight for a minute. Okay, and so if you wouldn't expect to know the reasons God has for permitting evil, right? You wouldn't expect to know them. So this basically takes away your justification for thinking that the evil is all things considered bad. And so for all you know, God has a good reason for allowing the child to burn to death horrifically, and experience all this pain. Presumably, you might even reason that the reason that God does this is for a net benefit on the part of the sufferer, right? However, when we look at scenarios such as the tribesman, it seems relevantly similar, right? It seems to me that if the tribesman is paralyzed in order to he's paralyzed and he doesn't have a reason to stop the surgeon from cutting his son open, then it seems to me that you would also be paralyzed, because for all you know, God is acting in the child's best interest, right? Now, it could be that God is attacking the child because, or not attacking the child, but is permitting the child to burn to death because he wants the good of you saving the child to be actualized. But it seems to me that that's implausible because God would be using the child as a mere means to an end. He'd be basically permitting the child to suffer, so someone else can save the child. That doesn't seem to me like something that would be consistent with moral perfection. At least that seems intuitive to me. So it seems to me that overall that this is an implausible reply. I know, like, I'm sort of like gibberating a little bit, and I'm really like talking over myself. I'm really, really, really sort of not focused right now, and I probably need to get a drink of water. I started out pretty good, but I'm really gibberating right now. So I'm probably gonna advise to skip over this section because I really like talked over myself a bit.
And thought very hard about the problem. I think it's a multifaceted approach. But I do think that Alex, at most,
So basically, what my response is that I think that there's a relevantly similarity with the tribesman, and if the tribesman's paralyzed from saving his son, then so are you paralyzed from saving the child from burning to death.
like, if you're weighing, like, it makes God really implausible, that's got to be weighed against the reasons for God.
Yeah.
And then it gets really difficult, like how we assign mathematical values. And
This is why I think, for instance, this is why I think it benefits
So yeah.
you to press like an evidential logical distinction, because if you say something like, well, what you're presenting is really an evidential problem of evil, not a logical one, then if you present an argument for the existence of God that's logically valid, then you can say, as you said in our debate, that, well, like any amount of evidential evidence is not enough to overcome a logical argument on the other side.
I'm sorry. So even if you have like a logically valid argument and you think it's like a demonstration, you still have to ask, well, what's the plausibility of the premises, and that's going to come in a kind of scale, right? Some that are going to be more plausible than not, maybe only 60% plausible, and so on. And your justification for that's going to vary. So almost everything's going to be evidential, which I'm very sympathetic to Jordan's point. But
That's right.
like, I don't really think there's, even when you have these sorts of demonstrations, even in mathematics, you have to assess, well, how plausible is this premise? And at some point you're just drawing intuition, seemings, and so on. But setting that aside, you did make a good point in response to the more paralysis objection, but that actually might turn against itself when you come back to the skeptical theist response to the problem of evil. As one briefly mentioned it, Paul Draper points this out. Even in response to these sorts of Bayesian arguments, you could say, yeah, maybe God has a morally sufficient reason. Maybe there are goods of which we're unaware that are necessarily connected with these evil states of affairs. But it's also equally true that there might be further evils of which you're unaware that are connected with these sorts of things.
Yep. That's another response that Michael Tooley brings up as well.
You can add that, but it seems as though the epistemic reasons of which we're unaware that are like good making features that are goods that might come about from this evil. It seems as though that's canceled out from further bad things that might even come about, and just horrendous things of which we are unaware as well. And so once those cancel out, we're just left with the first order reasons. And the first order reasons, even granted by skeptical theists, favor like God not allowing these sorts of things, because we know that this is such a bad state of affairs. So it's going to cut both ways.
well, let me get back a little, because
Yes, I think Joe also makes a good point there, but I also think another good point is the tribesman analogy. If you're paralyzed in the case of the tribesman and his son, like he isn't, you could use similar skeptical theist style reasons, right? Like if the tribesman, the tribesman doesn't understand the reason why the surgeon is cutting up his son, but if there were reasons for the surgeon to cut up his son, the tribesman doesn't have any reason to expect that he would have access to them, right? And the tribesman knows that the surgeon is well intentioned. Let's say he just has access to the fact that the surgeon is well intentioned, he's trustworthy, he's acting in the son's best interests, right? Then it seems the tribesman is very much prevented from having reasons, or is very much paralyzed, I should say, in terms of acting, and trying to prevent the surgeon from stop from healing his son, right? And it seems to me that this is relevantly similar to skeptical theism, right? If God is permitting a child to be burned to death, then he must be doing so for great benefits on the part of the sufferer, right? Because otherwise he'd be, horrifically abusing the sufferer to achieve some other end, right? Which doesn't seem compatible with moral perfection. So the only plausible reason God could be permitting suffering on the part of the sufferer is if it entails great benefits on the part of the sufferer. But if it doesn't entail great benefits on the part of the sufferer, then this sort of prevents you from having reason to stop the child from burning to death, or stop whatever suffering is taking place, because the only reason you would have to stop the child from suffering is if you thought stopping the burning to death, or helping the child in some other way from drowning, or like any other evil scenario you can think of. The only way you would have like a good reason to do that is if you thought that helping the child would be benefit for the sufferer. But in actuality, if it's not a benefit for the sufferer because God is permitting the suffering because it entails benefits on the part of the sufferer, well, then this sort of just control out the least your reasons for preventing the suffering, because you wouldn't actually be benefiting the sufferer. You wouldn't actually be helping the sufferer. You'd just be, well, it wouldn't be a morally valuable choice at all, right? Like there wouldn't be any reason for you to prevent the sufferer's suffering. And Joe also made a good point there, that if it's the case that humans have good reason to prevent suffering, because the only reasons we know of are the reasons we immediately have access to. So we don't know what reasons God might have for permitting the suffering, but we do know that one of the goods that God could achieve by permitting the suffering is the good of a human free choice. Well, that's also going to cut back on God. We don't know the reasons. Like epistemically, it could be the case that there are more unknown wrong-making factors than there are unknown good-making factors, and they cut against each other, right? So, any reason we might have for thinking that, like basically that it just sort of epistemically weighs out. Like any reason like we might have for thinking that like we don't have access to God's reasons. Well, sure, God, there might be unknown right-making properties that outweigh all the unknown wrong-making properties, and but there also might be like unknown wrong-making properties that cancel out the unknown right-making properties, and there also might be unknown wrong-making properties that outweigh the unknown right-making properties, or there might not be any unknown right-making or wrong-making properties, which means that the evil, it's only one of the four possibilities under which God has good reason to permit the evil, right? And epistemically, we don't have any reason to favor any of these possibilities over the other. So probabilistically, it just turns out to be pretty low that all the evils are such that God has reason to permit them, right? So it's sort of like if you want to use that kind of reasoning to say that humans have good reason to act on the reasons they have, then well, it seems to me that we can say something analogous to the God case, right? The reasons we have access to are that the inscrutable evil seems evil without like any consideration of unknown goods or unknown wrongs. So, given the reasons we have now, we now have access to the reasons we have access to about the evils right now. It seems all things considered, we have reason to expect that God would prevent the evil. So, if we have all things considered reason to prevent evil ourselves because the reasons we have access to are such that they count in favor of us, acting and saving the child, then we can say the same thing about God, right? If that makes sense. I hope it makes sense, right? But also, if you want to say that like that there's an entailing relation between the evil we see and great benefits from the part of the sufferer, then I also think that this moral paralysis worry still cuts through and is still a big worry.
With your concern, I do feel like, though, it's like we weigh these different arguments, evidentially, they're trying to prove different things. And so many of the arguments for God are just showing there's a kind of necessary, sustaining, external, transcendent cause of the universe. And some of them purport to show the moral qualities of God. It would be like saying, two orphans are arguing, they live in a horrible situation in their orphanage. And like if we had loving parents, we wouldn't have ended up here. Like, well, there's a possibility and this or that. And then one of them just says, no, this clearly shows we don't have parents. I'm sure the other orphan would say, well, we clearly have parents. I mean, where did we come from? Now it seems like we're disputing whether they're loving or not. Yeah. So it seems like the concern about suffering, it's really focused in on one particular, either power or love, but not necessarily necessity, infinite, immutable. So one could even have your, that there is, like Aristotle's God, an unmoved mover, essentially. Although then I guess the theist strategy to move forward would be, do we have more compelling reasons to think God is good, maybe by definition or necessity, than what presence of evils might sway us another way?
Yeah, I mean, you can even go further, as Stephen Law does. I made a video on his evil God challenge, where he imagines a God who is exactly opposite to the kind of God that we met with in traditional theism. We say we have a malicious God, an evil God, who basically seeks to bring about the worst possible outcome. Now, if I said that such a God existed, you would probably rightly laugh at me, in part because we're clearly not in the worst possible outcome. Like, if there was an evil God, he'd make things far worse for us than the way that they are. But of course, this mirrors the way that somebody who says that there's a good God, surely, like, this isn't as good as things could be. He could make things much better for us. And so what people do is they say, you have this problem of evil for a good God. But the evil God hypothesis has a problem of good. If there is an evil God, then why are there good things? Why is everyone suffering all the time? And you can actually construct equal and opposite theodicies. So you could say that, well, the reason why people are able to experience joy and happiness is because it makes it worse for the people who are not experiencing joy and happiness. They experience a deeper level and different kind of suffering, such as the suffering of loneliness, that cannot exist unless there are other people who are existing happily. And so if somebody, and Stephen Law's point is to say that because when you're faced with the evil God hypothesis, most people say that is just patently ridiculous because of the world we find ourselves in and how suffused with goods it is, that we should be fair in granting the alternative hypothesis, that when someone says there's a good God, we should just be saying that's patently absurd.
And my quick rejoinder to the evil God objection is that it only succeeds, this will get us down, and unfortunately we don't have another few hours to talk, I wish. I'm sure Joe has a lot of thoughts on this. It will turn on one's metaphysical understanding of the concepts of good and evil. That if good and evil are just competing substances that only differ trivially, like good is the red stuff and evil is the blue stuff, whatever, then the evil God objection might work. But if one had more of a privation view of evil, that good is more like metal and evil is more like rust, then the concept of an evil God, well, God who's completely evil, would not be this, nefarious being, would just be non-existent. And of course, I understand that there are controversial views about the privation theory of evil, but I think in a classical theistic model, that's a route that I would go in answering the objection.
But then isn't there a problem here? Because you said a moment ago that, well, I present a problem of evil, and you say, well, this doesn't remove the possibility of there being some kind of God who's just like amoral or something. But it seems to me that your own view about the nature of God and the nature of good commits you to saying that actually isn't a viable option, because you can't think of a...
But I think my view of the nature of God is superior to those that are incorrect. I don't know if that's arrogant to say or not.
But doesn't this mean that for what you just said a moment ago, that somebody could have a problem of evil and just say, at best this just shows that there's a not maximally moral God. That on your
or
own
they're
right?
agnostic about the deity's character.
But and we were talking about this in the context of having arguments for God's existence, and then you've got the problem of suffering, and you say, well, you've got the arguments of God's existence and the problem of suffering. So the problem of suffering maybe makes you think that God isn't good. But you still got the arguments which show that God is there. But the kind of arguments that you give, the kind of arguments that you support, do seek to establish that God is good by nature. And so you wouldn't be able to make that line as a theist. You wouldn't be able to say, well, yeah, you've got the problem of suffering, but you're not ruling out God. You're just ruling out a good God. You surely can't do that.
Of course not. But I don't think the existence of the route that I arrive. I agree. The route that with law, in that we cannot use empirical observation to determine whether God is essentially good or evil. I think that's a prior metaphysical question.
I was going
to
say that the response to the evil God hypothesis that I find plausible is that you don't rule out an evil God by looking at good in the world. Yeah. That's one of the premises of his argument, and so I just don't think that that's like the way to do it. You've got to do it other ways.
I would quite like to slightly change course and go back to something that we were talking about earlier, which is this idea of if you have goods that are kind of parasitic on evils, would we rather have no evil and no parasitic good, or would we rather have them both? I gave the example of Martin Luther King, and you said that you'd rather have the world in which there's racism to require a Martin Luther King for the sake of having Martin Luther King. I quite almost trivially think that it would be preferable to have no racism and no need for a Martin Luther King, because what it seems to me you're saying, if you say something like that you'd rather the former world, is saying something like we can be glad of the existence of cancer, because without the existence of cancer, we wouldn't have the good of people coming to develop chemotherapy and cancer research. And cancer research is a good thing. People giving to charity, people doing fundraising, this is a great thing. So isn't it great that we have cancer, because it allows this higher
Yeah, I agree with his point here.
good of cancer research, but clearly we'd rather have no cancer and no need for the cancer research. In the same way, I'd rather have no racism and no need for Martin Luther King. I'd rather have no fear and suffering and no need for bravery.
Well, I'll have a quick poetic rejoinder.
Of
course. One of my favorite musicals is Les Mis, based on the novel of Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. And many characters in there have quite miserable lives based on the revolution and poverty and death and very sad scenes in there. But the play it's quite beautiful at the end when the main character, Jean Valjean, dies and he is welcomed into heaven with those. And everyone is singing together that this has been overcome. It's probably one of the best descriptions of the gospel I've ever seen in media. And I feel like, would we rather have evil be non-existent or evil be defeated? And I think that many people see the importance there. If there is compensation, if we're all brought through, rather than just there not being evil. Because this gets back to the question that if the only good we're trying to pursue is just the reduction of suffering, then Thanos was 50% right.
You'd be amazed how often that specific example is given to me in these kinds of conversations.
Yeah. So I mean, I see what you're saying, and maybe Joe's right. This comes down to intuitions a little bit that we have. But I guess another example might be like, let's say I told you that it turns out this world is a simulation, and you're a program in a computer, and the universe is one guy with a supercomputer.
I think I've already responded to the compensatory goods point.
Would you rather have found out that this is a simulation or that this is real? Then you might be grateful if the suffering is gone. But it might also be kind of horrifying to realize all that seemed to be good was not real either. So I don't know if it's
Nice.
and dry.
C.S. Lewis had an example of...
You mean, sorry, the Matrix, I would say no, reality is different than what we thought.
Yeah,
It's definitely reality.
No, I agree, but is it a preferable kind of reality? That would go back to the philosopher Robert Nozick put forward something called an experience machine.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that are a little bit unfair about how Nozick treats the case. For example, he doesn't take into account something like status quo bias. He says, would you jump into an experience machine that brings you nothing but pleasure, but is actually just fake? And there are so many problems. The first is to say, this is different from if you were to wake up and it turns out you have been plugged into the experience machine, and the doctor say to you, listen, like your life sucks, like it's really bad, it's even worse than within the machine. I mean, the simulation,
outside.
yeah, like it's so much worse out here. But welcome back. But if you like, we'll plug you back in and forget it's ever happened. It's at least a lot more plausible that people in that situation would be like, yeah, put me back, right? So it might have a lot to do with kind of the situation already obtaining. Jumping into the experience machine feels different. Also, of course, we have necessarily a kind of omniscience when thinking about the situation. We can talk about being outside of the experience machine, inside the experience machine, what obtains, what the differences are. But to jump into the experience machine requires that you forget that you had the possibility to not do so or to do so. And so when somebody says that in the experience machine this would be a worse existence somehow, that intuition just doesn't land with me, because once you're in the machine, it's the same thing. You're just living a life and you're just experiencing reality as we experience this reality here.
Even if it's like a much worse life out there. I mean, I think empirical philosophers, people who go out and actually do these surveys of like folk intuitions and so on. You do get a resounding no to get an experience machine if you're like hopping into it for the first time. But you can actually turn tables like we're describing, and the situation is your life so far has been in an experience machine. Now you're faced with the choice to get out, and you're just I forget what it is, but you're just like it's not worse than your current position. It's not better. Maybe you're just like an artist in Kansas or something. Whatever.
Yeah, even
it's the same. A lot of people they actually found like a lot of people wouldn't get out of it, and it's like really I forget the specific results, but I think it's like I actually forget, but it's much more saying I'd stay because it's like the people that I know, like you guys, feel like I'd be in a different.
But then have they really reflected on it, like using phrases like the people I know?
Yeah, but this is the problem. But this is exactly what people do when they refuse to jump into the experience machine. I feel like what they're thinking is at least partly influenced by kind of I'd be giving up my life, I'd be giving up my friends, my family, I'd be adopting a whole new system. But of course, once you're in there, It just, I was sometimes asked, my university was split up into like a bunch of different colleges. There's no like singular campus. And people are always talking about how everybody seems to feel like they made the right choice with college. Everyone thinks that their college is the best college in the world. I wasn't such a fan of mine. I thought it was like, okay, I thought there were better ones. And my friends once said to me, but they said, but if you went to a different college, you never would have met us and we'd never be friends. And I said, well, yeah, but I'd have met other friends and I value them just as equally as I value you right now. And they thought that was a bit cold. But you get the point. Like, it seems like you wouldn't want to say that, right? In that situation, I might think, but if I went to a different college, I wouldn't have met the friends that I had right now. And sure, that's kind of bad. But if I were in that college, I'd be saying the same thing about those friends. And it's the same thing with the experience.
One other tack here. Like, let's say, what would we want God? How would we want God to treat us as creatures? Because one way we might say, well, I would like God to give me infinite happiness. That would seem fair if God gave me infinite happiness. If you could somehow numerically quantify happiness and it turned out to be infinite. Well, then by that logic, even if you had an absolutely horrific finite life, if you have infinite happiness in the afterlife, it would still turn out to be infinite happiness based on transfinite arithmetic. Then suppose you might say, well, no, God should just spare me from just like the absolute worst evils. Because many people would say they're willing to tolerate some evil, but not others. But I worry maybe their intuitions are off even in that, given how the entire system is set up in that regard. So,
there's nothing worth considering, which is that I think a lot of the discussion around theodicy and around the problem of evil kind of assumes a consequentialism. This is something that a friend of mine, his name's Dan Warner, he brought this.
I agree with that point. I do think that there's a lot of consequentialist assumptions into a lot of problem of evils and a lot of axiological assumptions of problems of evils, well, like responses to problem of evil. I'd say, like in terms of theodicy, they assume a sort of consequentialism that it would be justified for God to permit all the evil we see if it entails greater goods, or a greater compossible whole, like a greater world, which seems to be a sort of consequentialism, which I take issue with. And I've mentioned that point earlier.
My attention, he said that like when you say something like, well, God has this good that he wishes to bring about, and so he'll allow all of this evil, as if to say like this good is somehow better than this evil, like there's more good brought about by allowing some evil, and that's why God allows it. But it may be that God, for instance, has a duty to bring about certain things, right? If God has some kind of moral duty to bring about free will, let's say, then it's not just that, well, free will is much better than the suffering that it entails. Like even if the suffering is far worse, if you've got a duty to bring about free will, it would still function as a theodicy. If there's some kind of duty to bring about compassion, or to bring about bravery even, then even if like a world in which there's no bravery and no fear is much better, consequentially, from a kind of crude utilitarian perspective, that's a better world than one in which there is bravery, but there's also the fear and suffering. If there's something a bit more like deontological about this, that bravery is just something that must be brought about, then we don't need to debate whether that's a better world or a worse world than where there's no bravery and suffering, because the theodicy doesn't work in saying that the evil is kind of worth the...
I'm not sure. I think it's actually the opposite. I think that if God is justified in like permitting all this suffering, as long as it brings about greater good, such as free will or courage, all these virtues, I think that's actually kind of consequentialist, if anything, right? Because if God, like if there were these like duties for God to like never harm, like it's just wrong for God to use rational agents as a mere means to an end, or if it's just wrong for God to horrifically torture or allow horrific torture to befall infants. If it was just wrong, like God had a duty to prevent those things. God had a duty, like just no matter what the consequences are, God had a duty to prevent, like skin diseases, natural disasters. Seems like that would be the deontological view, and the view that God is justified in permitting all of this suffering, and God does not have these duties as long as they bring about a greater good, such as free will. If anything, that seems to be more like a consequentialist, because consequentialism doesn't necessarily mean like utilitarianism, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that what you're seeking to maximize are hedonic outcomes such as pleasure, right? You could also be like a sort of pluralist consequentialist, and the kind of outcomes you want to maximize are like virtues, other goods such as like people seeking the truth, people building souls, people like free will. So it seems to me that there's a kind of consequentialism that's inherent in the sort of theodical attacks that theists bring about to attack the problem of evil. I think that if anything, it's the theodicies that assume consequentialism, not the atheists, not the ontology. They don't assume deontology. Like I'd say that they that if anything, that there's a sort of consequentialism here.
Well, the good is worth the suffering on a kind of balance, but that the good requires that any amount of evil would still be allowed to obtain because there's a duty to bring something about. So it's weird how otherwise generally deontological religious thinkers, when we're having discussion, are perfectly happy to just kind of adopt a consequence.
I would say it's teleological, not necessarily consequential. It aims for a particular kind of end, informed by goodness, but it's not strict kind of consequentialism. God treats creatures as having a particular kind of dignity and good to share in Him, who is the ultimate goodness itself. I guess, yeah, it will come down maybe to intuitions about when we say like goodness. There seems like there are these different kinds of goods, if we imagine them. And I think you're right, some of them are conjoined to evils. Is it really better to never have them at all? Maybe Joe's right. Maybe that's just a very basic. That's just when it comes to the existence of God. Some people find a principle sufficient reason plausible, others don't. And I think this might be one of those very, like, to me, it does seem. And I try to make an analogy. I know they're not perfect, but like to creating life, revolution, or even having your own children. And it's like, well, I know. You could take. Actually, this is something I saw. You should look this up. So Matt Dillahunty did a reply to, as people asked about antinatalism.
Why are you bringing up Matt Dillahunty?
Have
you seen, when you debated him on the resurrection?
Yes.
And you mentioned my name as an
Why are you bringing up
example.
Alex O'Connor?
Why are you bringing up Alex O'Connor?
At least from what I saw with your engagement with Alex O'Connor, you do not
my
believe a
God.
person. What's wrong?
What the hell does Alex O'Connor have to do with this? You mentioned him twice.
He was
Why are
so
you
mad.
bringing
All
up-
I asked him was, Matt, are there beliefs that you disagree with but find to be reasonable?
And you were like,
no.
you were
He said
like,
no.
yeah.
He said no. He said there are no beliefs that if he says I'm a reasonable person. That if someone disagrees, there must be. I was like,
He said just as an example, he was like, so for example, Alex O'Connor's veganism, you think he's wrong, but maybe reasonable.
he wouldn't do it.
Why are you bringing
Wouldn't do it.
But sorry, Matt Dillahunty.
So Matt did a reply. People asked him about antinatalism.
Yeah.
The idea, like, well, is it moral to have children, knowing that they could suffer and you bring someone into existence and they're harmed and you didn't get their consent? And all the while, watch the video. All the while I was watching the video, he was saying, well, there are harms, but there's also these goods that come into play when you bring a child into existence. And we balance that. And I was like, it sounds like a theist responding to the problem of evil.
Yeah.
So I just found that. So sometimes I like to bring up these other examples and say, oh, well, if it can make sense in one context, albeit it's analogical and there's limits, perhaps it can make sense in another.
There are some incredible similarities between the discussion about bringing children into existence and God bringing us human beings into existence. And it's even kind of a useful analogy in the way it's you're talking about the father and his children.
Right, and so that's
there
why
are so many similarities.
Right,
in
so
the
I think that if you're partial to say, oh, I can see that there's a benefit here, even though there's costs that are involved, I would push that towards, oh, maybe it can at least be more sensible. God would create, and he has more resources than human parents.
This is sometimes informed by the fact that people who kind of on balance, there are a lot of people who live a life that on balance has had more suffering than pleasure. Maybe it's like 60-40 or something, and yet at the end of their life will think it was worth having. And there are also ways that pleasures and pains kind of balance out in asymmetrical ways. For instance, I mean, David Benner talks a lot about this of course, in Better Never to Have Been. For instance, a life that begins with a lot of suffering but then gets better over time, versus a life that begins with a lot of pleasure and gets worse over time. These don't seem to be equal. They can't just be like a crude balancing of pleasures and pains. There seems to be something about the worth of living through this experience that needs to be
I would
taken.
love to ask Benatar if, let's say, Christian theism were true. Let's just hedge our bets with Christian universalism. Everybody goes to heaven. I wonder if that would change his thesis.
It surely has to.
You would think.
Yeah, no, must do.
It has to.
Well, why don't we send him an email and see if he
Go right
see
ahead.
things. Oh, well, maybe I'll do then. And
can ask-
if he responds, I'll
Yeah, so
something on
you say
Twitter.
theism, they might qualify universalism. Everyone goes to heaven.
Yeah, well, let's ask him.
And then, I don't know, this would be an interesting route to explore also for more discussions on problem of evil. I don't know.
Well, this has been quite a roundtable. I think we've covered a lot of ground and had some interesting discussions, and I hope that people find this useful. Of course, it's great to have all people in a room, but it also makes it harder to hear everybody out on everything. But I think we struck up a good balance.
Really well.
Is there anything like pressing that anybody else is like just dying to get out there before we wrap up?
No, not pressing. I have other things that I want to talk about, but I think I may save it for dinner.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
Sorry,
building up this courage. This is how people act.
I think that we can at least all agree that the problem of evil is a very important topic, and
Yeah,
it makes a lot of intuitive sense, and it's something that's really worth considering. I mean, my kind of final analysis of the situation is that it's often framed, the problem of evil is often seen as like the best response to theism. It's like you have this religion, and in response you get the problem of evil. Why are people suffering? Why are people nihilists? Why is life so apparently meaningless? But to me, I feel like this is actually the wrong way around. I feel like the best treatment of the nihilistic condition is not found in David Benatar. It's not found in like modern atheistic writers. It's found in Ecclesiastes, right? It's found in Job. It's found in Psalms. And it says to me that maybe it's not that the problem of suffering is like a response to religion, but rather religion itself was a response to the problem of suffering.
Maybe that's the thing I would close with. Like for me, more of an intuitive end to this is there's also one practical reply to this. It's that if you get rid of God, you still have evil. You still have just pure awfulness. Like I do wonder at what I would do if I were put to the test. Like if my family died in an accident, I went through Job's trial. I had cancer. I was just brought to my lowest. How would I respond to that? And my friend Jimmy Aiken, for example, I love what he says on problem of evil because he's dealt with personal tragedy. His wife died of an illness shortly after they were married. He never remarried. And the way he looked at it is, well, Christianity is my one hope to be reunited with my wife and for evil to be conquered. It's the one hope for evil to be answered, for there to be a solution. Why would I give that up without there being a good argument against? So I guess for me, like with evil, I'm just so thrilled at the prospect of Christianity answering it. I refuse to give up Christianity unless there is another independent reason to show that it's false, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, of course I can sympathize with that. I guess I would just say, I equally would love it to be true, and if I believed it, would never want to give it up. But as I say, I think that may indeed be why these religious ideas exist in the first place, rather than being the other way around. But maybe that's something we can discuss tomorrow, because of course we're here in Houston to do the event that I mentioned earlier, which, as I say, will be in the past. So I'm sure that a lot of these threads will probably be continued at some point tomorrow. So I'll make sure that everything's linked down in the description. But yeah, this has been edifying. So thank you all for
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us on your
This
show.
has been great. For everybody watching, a quick reminder that everything I do is supported by you on patreon.com/cosmic skeptic. Special thanks as always.
Alright, yeah, so that's basically it. And yeah, I don't really have much to say. I basically let the video play out most, like towards the end there. I didn't really have much else to add because I pretty much added all I needed to add, mostly towards the beginning. All the standard sort of responses to the problem of evil, and the standard responses to those responses. So there's not much further to add there. Of course, I did some gibbering in between there, like especially towards the middle there. I sort of gibberated a bit and gaffed a bit, and it's what's to be expected. I should probably do scripted videos instead of streams. In any case, this was decent, I guess. Decent waste of time, couple hours, I guess. Didn't have much else to do anyways. So with that, I guess I will be peacing out. And see you, my fellow heathens. Bye.